Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Keith Watterson, and I've been asked to be the chairman tonight for this requisition meeting. We don't appear to have enough chairs for everybody, but I hope that everybody can be seated shortly. Looks as if it might be a bit of a tall order, though. It's very pleasing to see so many of you here, so much interest being shown tonight. This is a requisition meeting that's been called for the House of Keys by-election in West Douglas, as I'm sure you all know. I'd just like to remind you before we start of the evacuation procedure. Hopefully we shouldn't have one, but should the fire alarm system go off or we need to evacuate for any reason, there's the door that you came in there is one exit, and on my right in the front here is the second exit, the alternative. And the toilets are located in the porch over at the main entrance, entrance there as well. Well, the meeting has been called by the Worshipful Mayor in response to a requisition that's been signed by a number of the constituents of West Douglas. Whilst there is no statutory obligation on the Mayor to call the meeting, she has done so in the public interest. It's to be noted that there is similarly no statutory obligation on the candidates to attend or to take part, but I'm pleased to say that all 4 candidates, as you can see, are here tonight and willing to take part. The Worshipful Mayor has asked myself to be chairman for tonight, of which I'm grateful to accept. The format of the meeting will be that each candidate will be given up to 5 minutes to introduce themselves and to address the meeting in relation to the issues as they see as significant at this election. I will be keeping a time of that 5-minute period. At 4 minutes, I'll give a ring on a bell, which indicates that you've a minute left. At the 5-minute mark, I would expect the candidates to draw their remarks to a close. After those opening addresses, written questions will be taken. I've already got some here, but there's a form on the table at the back there and some pens like that. Either submit it on the form, or if you have your own paper and written questions already prepared, then please bring them forward. They'll be taken in the order at which I receive them, and if there's time afterwards, we'll take questions from the floor, oral questions. At about 9:30, I would hope that we'll be through, but questions will end. The chairman will then offer the candidates an opportunity to sum up, and that will be a 2-minute time period for each candidate again in turn. And hopefully the meeting will be closed and we'll all be away for about 10 o'clock. Thank you very much. The candidates from my left, your right, are Mr. Clive Dawson, Mr. Quintin Gill, Mr. John Skinner, and Mr. Christopher Thomas. And without further ado, I will ask Mr. Clive Dawson, if he's ready. Would you mind, sir, to rise to your feet and tell us what you have to say to the constituents of West Douglas. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming this evening. I do hope this is an exciting spectacle, and you won't be disappointed in missing the Benfica-Chelsea Europa Cup final. My name is Clive Dawson, and by now most of you should have received my manifesto and my introductory letter, and in that I outlined my Manx heritage, my personal and professional background, my family connections, but also more importantly the issues and the policies on which I stand. Can I also thank you for being so pleasant and engaging on the doorstep? It's not easy knocking on over 2,000 doors trying to raise up support for your own candidacy. I've had some great conversations with you. I've met some old friends, I've met some new, and I've also met some relations who I haven't seen for a number of years. But above all, I've met an electorate who are very well informed, who are prepared to put the local issues to one side in favour of the national issues. I've met an electorate who for so long have been the silent majority and who don't want to be silent anymore. Ladies and gentlemen, things have changed. And no longer are we a sleepy, wealthy little island nestled in the middle of the Irish Sea. No longer are we swimming as a reasonably big fish in the small pond of the British Islands and the British overseas territories. We have in fact been cast adrift. We now find ourselves as a very small fish in the very big world pond, where there are some very, very big fish and some even bigger sharks. In the last couple of years alone, we have seen our VAT receipts cut by the United Kingdom government. We are in the midst, as you've heard from me previously, in a tsunami of anti-offshore legislation. And let me give you some examples. United States FATCA agreement, the United Kingdom FATCA agreement, the European FATCA agreement, which is about to hit our shores imminently, and another European savings legislation number 2, which is also apparently ready to hit us. And whilst we try to diversify our economic base and increase our income, it is against this backdrop that the government is trying to rebalance its budget whilst trying to meet the needs of over 80,000 of its citizens. Ladies and gentlemen, the job of an MHK has changed dramatically and will evolve further in the future. It has never been more important at this stage, I think, than for the Douglas Town Councillors, of which there are 18, and the members of the House of Keys for Douglas, of which there are 8, to work closely in partnership to meet the needs of the Douglas community in an efficient manner. MHKs are effectively, in my view, directors of Isle of Man Limited. Their remit is not only to the constituents of Douglas West, but to the wider audience of Douglas, the Isle of Man, and the international marketplace. They must understand the new economic order, the new economic reality. They must deal with situations professionally, think strategically, deal internationally, and inspire confidence amongst those who would wish to invest in the Isle of Man. Above all, I feel, they must combat the drive to stop the freedom of speech, the freedom of thought, the freedom of choice of the silent majority, the freedom to say no without explanation, the freedom not to agree with every demand of every minority, the freedom to discuss issues without being labelled with derogatory names such as scaremonger, fascist, or racist. Ladies and gentlemen, I was challenged to raise issues. I think I've done so in my manifesto and the things that I've said so far. I hope you too will take the opportunity tonight to raise the issues that need addressing, and I look forward to a full and lively debate. Thank you very much.
Now I'd like to ask the second of the candidates to speak, Mr. Quintin Gill.
Thank you, Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, Pastor Mai, good evening. It's a pleasure to see so many people here, a reflection of the interest of this important by-election. And it's not only a by-election which is important to Douglas West, it is, I would say, a by-election which is important to the government and to the whole of the Isle of Man. We do, as Clive has said, face very difficult challenges which arguably should have been addressed by the previous administration, but have to be addressed by this administration. Whoever is elected to serve Douglas West will not only be serving the constituency, but must also serve the Isle of Man's best interests, the Isle of Man's needs. The role of an MHK has evolved, but it's effectively got the same fundamental 3 points. Certainly it's got 2 points. You are a parliamentarian. We make legislation that affects the whole of the Isle of Man and our international legislation. We work, and we should be constituency representatives. And equally, and arguably, we should be members of government. Or we should certainly be holding government to account. Now, I don't think that now is the time for negativity with our government. I think now is the time for constructive working together, and that is my track record. I have served for 10 years in the House of Keys in Rushen, when I lived in the south of the Isle of Man, I moved to Douglas, where my family are originally from, last year, and this is my permanent home. My commitment is to living in Douglas and to serving the people of this constituency. And I would do that if I were elected, not only as a constituency and a parliamentary member, but if offered as a member of government. But I would not do that uncritically. I have never done that uncritically, and where government deserves support, we should have a duty to support them. Where they do not deserve support, and we can all think of examples where that's been the occasion, then they deserve opposition. And that has been my track record, and that's what I will continue to do if I'm elected to represent you. Now, I'm not going to read from a speech. I'm more interested in answering your questions. That's the purpose of this evening. So once again, I would like to thank everybody for making the effort to come and attend. This is an important meeting, because you have an important decision to make as a consequence of not only what you hear tonight, but what you read in our manifestos. And my manifesto has been distributed. If you don't have a copy and would like one, please see me at the end of the meeting. And I would be more than happy to be quizzed on anything I've written in that manifesto or anything in my political track record. My commitment is to public service. It always has been. And I think I can make the biggest difference for the benefit of the Isle of Man as your representative. Gora mai.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gill. And the next and third candidate is Mr. John Skinner.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And first, could I thank you all for taking time to attend this evening's meeting. And next Thursday, the electorate of Douglas West will again go to the polls to elect a member of the House of Keys to fill the current vacancy in our constituency. Encouraged by the support I received at the general election and indeed in the 2012 Douglas Council election, where I topped the poll in Murray's ward, I have put my name forward to stand in this election. As I've said many times previously, I believe it is important to live within the constituency and to be a part of the community that exists within it. We've had a good source of revenue for our island over the past few years from the finance sector, more recently e-gaming. However, we must not lose sight of other benefits we have to offer, such as shipping and aircraft registers. With this in mind, there is a need to improve and maintain top-class facilities, for instance, to support engineering apprenticeships, to provide a workforce with skills fit for the future. The Isle of Man is still a great place to be and to live, and we should advertise it. The fact that we still hold an interest of people from all over the world who want to come and experience what we have and enjoy here. We can rightly be proud of our island's beauty and our heritage, and we should not be afraid to show it off. Although not as prolific as many of us remember, tourism still provides a percentage of our income, and we could increase this further by encouraging visitors to our shores through specialised short break stays. And there remains vacancies within the hospitality sector, which are now being recognised as real career paths for many. We still face difficult times, and we should recognise that in this we are not unique, but we are more successful than many other economies in the world. I'm glad to see that government now appears to be communicating better with the public. However, I still believe there is some way to go in this area, and it has to be remembered that the taxpayers are major stakeholders in the Isle of Man. Each and every one of us over the age of 16 in the constituency has the right to vote on polling day, and I would urge everyone to exercise that right next Thursday. Thank you.
And the fourth candidate is Mr. Christopher Thomas. And I think there was a timely reminder there when I heard somebody's mobile phone giving a little tinkle. If anybody does have a phone switched on, could they just put it on to discreet, please, so as not to disturb the candidates and the session later when questions are asked. Mr. Thomas, thank you.
And Mr. Weston, Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming this evening. I'm delighted to share with you some thoughts at the beginning of what I am sure will be a very valuable discussion. One thing you'll be doing is assessing my capability and my approach as your public representative. And I just draw on some of the things that my colleagues have said, and I would like to say that I am part of this community, and I believe in constructively working together, and indeed what I bring extra and special I believe is that I'm financial, analytical, political, and know that working together with whomever, I can get something done for the good of the community as your public representative. This evening, I hope you will also be considering my vision and policies which, with my approach, will form the way that I would work as your public representative. So let's imagine that situation. What would it be like next week, Friday, if I was to be your representative? What would I do? Well, I think the first thing that would happen to me would be, I understand, that I would get a letter asking me for my bank details. I assure you I would put that to one side, because I think that's a bit, I know a number of MHKs who thought that was slightly disrespectful for the task and the role that they were assuming. Then, of course, I would deal with public administration in the sense that until we have an ombudsman in this island, an important part of the role of an MHK is to make sure you get what is worth coming to you, what's having to you, whether it's rights, responsibilities, whatever. It's the role of an MHK to make sure that council, government, any other organisation does its duty towards you, and you have to make sure that you do your duty towards them. Then, most importantly, I would turn to my manifesto, because that is, what this is all about, being an MHK. It's about saying you're going to do something and then actually doing it, ladies and gentlemen. So I don't actually agree with Mr. Dawson, who said that the role of an MHK has changed. I don't think we're primarily directors of Isle of Man PLC. We are your public representatives, putting a programme to help this Isle of Man, all its people, be very successful internationally, to have a wonderful community in harmony, prosperous community working together. So, number one point on my manifesto is to hold a referendum on parliamentary reform and reduce the number of politicians. For 35 years, people have been saying, let's reform Tynwald, perhaps even let's have less politicians, and that's something that's important to me. So day one, I would start thinking about that petition for the redress of grievance that I would like to take in July, or perhaps July next year, hopefully July this year, to begin that process of moving towards a referendum in April 2016, which would cost practically nothing because we're having local authority elections that day. And it would also take this issue that's been upsetting people in Parliament and society for all those years out of Parliament, not wasting any more drafting time, not wasting any more time in the chamber, because once and for all the public could have a go. Point number two on my manifesto is to think about giving all local people a stake in the Manx Electricity Authority, and perhaps also addressing an issue that a great number of people around here have talked about, which is revitalising the bond issuance programme. £70 million of our money is being used and has already been used by agreement with the government to pay off MEA debts. So why not give it to us in the same way that Royal Bank of Scotland, it's rumoured, might one day be given to the people in the United Kingdom who've had their national reserves used for that purpose. We've got to also think about the cost of living in this country, because we have to ask ourselves, why is it we have problems getting secondary school teachers here? And that sort of thing. It might not only be because of the work permits, it might also be because the cost of living is so bad here and their pensions can't be transferred that easily. So we need to think about rates, as I've done in the council. We need to think about electricity prices, and I've showed you one way. We need to think about the steam packet, and I'm looking for a competitive tender if there's any possibility that the user agreement is going to be extended, and so on and so on. And with your vote, I would work as your public representative for the next 3.5 years, and I look forward to discussing with you this evening. Thank you very much.
I'll now take written questions. I've got probably about 8 here already. They're not addressed to any particular candidate, but if anybody does submit a written question for a particular candidate, it will be put to that candidate first, and then the other 3 will have an opportunity to respond as well. Most of the questions don't have a name and address, and I would ask the Deputy Clerk, is the submission of a name and address required?
Not necessarily, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The first question is to all candidates: would you support an elected LegCo at the same time as a House of Keys election. What I'll do is I'll start with Mr Dawson, and then for each question move along one candidate at a time so that they all get a turn of being first.
Sure.
So,
Yeah, in my manifesto I made it clear that I do support the public election of LegCo. Would it be on the same day? Yes, it could be, but rather than having a second MHK, perhaps in the, for example, Douglas West, I would like to discuss an issue whether we should have LegCo elected more on a national basis. Because what I don't think we need is a LegCo that is sort of has any particular liaison with the local community. I think they should be more above that and be able to legislate without the pressures of a constituency. So there may be 10 or 12 names on that list that people, when they go to vote for their MHK, also take a vote for a member of the Legislative Council.
thank you, Mr Dawson. Mr Gill?
Thank you. So the question is, would we have an elected Legislative Council as well as a popularly elected House of Keys? We do have an elected Legislative Council. It's not popularly elected. My preference would be that it was popularly elected, but it isn't. It has a much stricter, a much tougher threshold to meet. You have to get more than 50% of the members of the House of Keys to support you. Now, that's the system we have. Would it be better popularly elected? Yes. There's been a number of bills that have been put forward, and the detail has always been found wanting. So in principle, yes, it's a great thing to have. Is that a good idea to share that with the House of Keys election? I personally believe it is. Should that be at the same time? Yes, it should. What time of year? I would say, actually having canvassed in autumn, winter, and now what comes to amongst summer, that summertime is the very best time to have those elections anyway, because it increases turnout, it increases interest, as we see tonight. So the answer to your question is yes, we should, but the detail shouldn't be overridden. And before we start saying Legislative Council is a bad thing because they're not popularly elected, they serve a very important function, and they hold the House of Keys and they hold government to account in a way that there is no other mechanism to do. So Legislative Council, however they're elected, serve a very valuable purpose. And my role as an MHK will be to support them and empower them, but I do think the principle should be met.
If I may say something further, it's not seen as transparent, and people think it's a bit of an old boys club. That's the trouble with the Legislative Council at the moment. I've spoken to people on the doorstep who've said, yes, it's okay, it'd be nice if we could change it, but I think a lot of perspective in this constituency I'm finding out is that people think there's some underhanded way in which old boys are elected from the Keys, don't serve their full term as a elected representative, and suddenly get elected to this old boys club.
Sorry. I'd like to really each candidate to speak in turn. Okay. Thank you very much. Mr Skinner? Thank you.
Yes, I mean, the comment that Mr Dawson has made there is quite valid, hence we find ourselves in the position where we are tonight, with one of the members that was elected at the last general election being put to Legislative Council. My view is that Legislative Council is actually a revising body, and it's there to scrutinise legislation and other bits of law, etc. Whether it should be elected on the same day as the Keys, then I don't think so. I mean, the Keys is actually the powerhouse behind legislation. LegCo has a duty to scrutinise it. In an ideal world, it could be elected, but it's whether you could sort of give them different powers, or whether there's another way round it, of perhaps them being independently appointed apart from the Keys. And I mean, there are those who could say that perhaps the Appointments Commission isn't exactly the most independent body that there is, but there are different ways that members of the Legislative Council could be appointed. With the view at the moment that we should be looking to restructure government and local government, if the island was split, then you could have 2 north, south, east and west, gives you the 8, and they could then canvass within those areas. There's something else which I was going to say, but I've forgotten. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Mr Thomas?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to the questioner. I think in the answers we've actually already identified the three of the issues that have prevailed when things have been suggested, when changes have been suggested in the past. Firstly, if we have it on the same day, we actually lose one of the only good things about the current system, which is bills can carry on between parliaments, which is helpful from time to time in a democracy. And if we had them on the same day, I imagine that would be lost. The second thing is, if we have this roughly the same way of electing somebody, you have all sorts of constitutional problems. For 100 years, the Keys has been trying to make sure it's understood that it is supreme. And if we start moving towards direct elections, however the constituencies are organised in the Isle of Man, basically we've got the same people electing. It's not like America or Germany where you have states and a federal administration, and we'd end up with all sorts of confusion. So I'm minded, as I said in my introduction, to actually abolish both the Keys and Legco and to have direct elections to Tynwald. And I'm not wacky or radical saying that, because somebody called Dudley Butt tweeted that, and I don't regard him as a radical or something like that. He's a policeman or something, wasn't he, in his olden days? I never met a radical policeman. So he said, he actually said dump history. Well, I forget that bit. I mean, I like history. Culture, history, tradition, they're very important. But he said abolish Keys and Legco and just have a 32-seat Tynwald popularly elected. Why do we need 32? That's my question. And my way forward, that's the important thing, a way forward. These issues are the ones that have bedeviled this discussion for 35 years. From this constituency, Mr Neil has come along, Mr Delaney has come along, lots and lots of people have come along with great ideas. The time is right now to do it with a referendum. This is the period of referenda, and we need one in the Isle of Man for constitutional issues. And in April 2016, we need a referendum on parliamentary reform. You don't have referendum in a vacuum. We need an independent commission, just as the Chief Minister suggested a few months ago, to consider these issues, to work out whether the policy review committees are actually doing the work of the Legislative Council now, how we can improve the legislative process and the drafting of regulations and those sorts of things, so that Tynwald, with my help, or with one of these guys' help, can actually put together a referendum that they can all agree to, that the Deemster and the Clerk of the Rolls has to go about organising a referendum in April 2016. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The second question, which will be answered first by Mr Gill, is what is your opinion on the proposed plans for landlord registration? Mr Gill.
I should declare an interest, as I actually do rent a property. If you'd asked me this 2 weeks ago, quite frankly, I'd have said, well, the headline press coverage that I've read seems very bland and very positive. It's about making landlords responsible to maintain property at a certain standard, and it gives additional rights to people who are renting, and it's all good news. It's all happy stuff, and who could possibly object? However, last night I went to a meeting of the newly formed Manx Landlords Association, and having researched the legislation and the impact that it would have, I have grave misgivings. I was brought up with the phrase, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And the good intentions of this bill maybe are there. Maybe they're adding to bureaucracy. Maybe they're adding to the government's powers, and intrusive powers at that. But certainly what they're adding is to make landlords have to face increasingly tough thresholds, which are not reasonable, in my opinion. They're not all reasonable, and they're not all necessary. And what would the effect of that be? The effect of that would be that the sector, which is a very important sector, not only for the people who rent, but all those people who are economically active in employment supporting that sector, would come under increasing pressure, and landlords would lose interest in running their businesses. It's a business. Now, I'm not in favour of landlords being abusive or not treating their tenants with total respect, and tenants should have rights and they should be protected. But if the premise of this bill is that it's to stop rogue landlords, that's all. The preface to landlords typically from government is rogue. If it's to stop that, I would ask them, how many rogue landlords have actually been brought to book for their roguishness? And the answer is none. So you think, well, why do we need this? Why do we need this legislation? And not only this legislation, all legislation. The first question is, why do we need it? And the second question will be, and what powers can we repeal while we're introducing this legislation? And this doesn't meet that first test. There is no presenting need for this legislation.
Mr. John Skinner, on what is your opinion on the proposed plans for landlord registration?
Well, it seems to me that this proposed the statement an Englishman's home, or rather his property, isn't his castle. I haven't sort of read into this too much, so I'll be honest. But if a landlord wants to be lord and master of his own property, then why shouldn't he be? As a gentleman said to me on the doorstep the other day, this isn't a landlord registration scheme. This is actually a tenant's charter, and it seems to put a lot of rights, etc., which tenants should have rights, into the hands clearly of the tenants. But if I was to own another property and wanted to rent it out, I mean, if I wanted to keep it empty, why shouldn't I be able to keep it empty? Why should I have Department of Social Care dictate to me that you've got to take this person, you've got to put them in your property? For whatever reason, I may not like the person. You know, I have in a former life come across some, dare I say, unscrupulous landlords in my time. But then, you know, regulations were brought in and action was taken against them. But I can understand why they would want to have landlords registered, but at the same time, this seems to me to be totally loaded in favour of the tenant, and the landlord can't do what he wants to. So this whole thing needs to be looked at in a whole different light, I think.
Thank you. And Mr. Thomas, please, what is your opinion on the proposed plans for landlord registration?
Thank you very much, Chairman. Good question again. Pleased to try to answer it. Massive topic. I think 4% of landlords give society and give the people who are their tenants problems. 96% don't. And I think that's official statistics, and it's always best to quote government statistics rather than statistics that might be argued. And my response is this. First part is that we already have long established legislation, 1955 Tenants Act, lots of other Landlord and Tenants Acts, I think 84, something like that. We have lots of acts, and I think what happened is, as society became less involved, perhaps through its prosperity in the last 20 years, people started forgetting the basics, and what we now need to do, as it says in my manifesto, is we need to remind people of the protections that tenants already have against public landlords and against private landlords. We need to remind people that there's the Rents and Rates Tribunal for looking at the price that they're paying. You know, I was shocked to discover that in the last 6 years, there have only actually been 7 appeals for consideration by the Rents and Rates Tribunal for things like rents. And there have been, you know, people don't make complaints about the standards that are already legislated for in the existing legislation. Housing is a massive issue, I accept that. And in fact, I brought up this very topic in the council housing submission back in April on the housing review. And I think at that point I said, council should consider whether it should be engaged in assessing the quality and helping landlords and tenants manage their relationship. But I think I was laughed at because somebody said, we better not get involved in that because our stock is some of the worst in some areas. So that's the point I want to make, which is that one flaw with this legislation is we need to make sure it's equal and it's across all people and all types of landlord and so on and so on. And the second point I want to make is, you know, registration is one thing, but I think this is rather more than that. You know, having a register and having a register of people who've caused problems to landlords and so on is one thing, but this seems rather more. It looks like it's getting into supervision and registration and enforcement under the existing legislation is what I prefer. There's all, you know, 10 years ago we did with 6,500 in the public service. We've now got 8,000 plus a hell of a lot more on bank staff and that sort of thing. And this to me sounds like a bit like bureaucracy being created when there's other approaches to solving the problem that needs to be addressed.
Finally, Mr Dawson, what are your opinions, sir, on the proposed plans for landlord registration?
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. It is the most draconian and ill-thought-out piece of legislation I've ever come across. It really is. To think that you would consider fining somebody £20,000 for not registering, I really don't understand where the Minister is coming from.
And 6 months in jail for some of them.
You wouldn't get such a sentence if you imported drugs into this country and supply them to the local school children. It needs reviewing, it needs stopping, and if I'm elected, I will vote against it.
This is a two-part question, and the first to answer it will be Mr Skinner. And the question is, in the 19th century, it was traditional at requisition meetings such as this to pelt the candidates with flour. To demonstrate support for your favourite candidate, would the candidates wish to reintroduce such a practice? Just a quick round, I think, on that one, please.
I wouldn't have any objection, provided it was FLOWERS flowers, but the other one I'm not so sure.
Thank you. Mr Thomas.
In fact, I'm always chosen as the guy at the community events at schools to get water and buckets thrown at, and I'm always the guy who's chosen to dress up in funny kit when I'm on the stage at the Villa Marina, so it'd be perfectly appropriate.
Thank you. Mr Dawson.
I think I prefer pound coins or £5 notes.
Mr Gill.
Thank you. Well, whoever is elected will have to get used to worse than flour being thrown at them. Politics really can be a very thankless job. And the serious point is, whoever is elected has to have the commitment and the tenacity and the sense of humour to be able to put up with what are often unfair criticisms, because that is what the territory that we're in. So should we be pelted with flour? No. Should we be criticised unfairly? No. Should politicians be praised actually when they do their best? Yeah, I think they should actually, and I hope that that will be a fair reflection.
Thank you. And the second part, the serious side of this, from the same questioner, is do the candidates agree with the basic premise of the scope of government report, that the government in the Isle of Man is too big, and what do they feel should happen now to respond to that report? Mr Skinner, thank you.
I don't fully understand what this questioner means when is government in the Isle of Man too big. Is that departments, ministerial departments, or what? There is room for scope, and I'll be honest, it's not a report which I am fully up to speed with. So I'm sorry, I don't really understand the question where that's coming from.
Thank you, Mr Thomas.
In 2006, the VAT and the other revenue sharing agreement was just about to be agreed between the United Kingdom and the Isle of Man. I don't know if agreed is the right word, but ultimately it's an agreement. Either side can give 2 years' notice. But even before that agreement, the people would have noticed, and people were beginning to notice, that the civil service and the public service had grown by that huge number that I gave you before, 1,500 growth on 6,500 start. So the basic premise, which is that perhaps government's got too big, is one that I agree with, and I am very aware of many of the conclusions that the 2006 Scope Committee spent 6 months arriving at, having full access to the civil servants to brief them about whatever questions they asked. And I'm pretty aware of the first Council of Ministers response, which John Shimon served on, our other Douglas West MHK, and I'm pretty aware of what the Council of Ministers came back with this time for Parliament to debate in the last 14 months or so. So my basic point is that we're going too slow since 2006 and in 2012. The conclusions were there already. Why didn't people say in their manifestos in 2011, this is what I think about the proposal on local government, this is what I think about the proposal on corporatisation, this is what I think about the proposal on charging user fees for sewage, this is what I think about removing subsidies from swimming pools and Manx radio and buses and so on, because that was all there. We've had it there for 6 or 7 years. It's just we had a slightly dishonest election last time because everybody was pretending something was like it was, which it wasn't. It clearly wasn't like it was. So to me, this is the most profound issue. I agree with John. The question is vague. Big government, what does that mean? I took the point of view that the questioner probably meant it was the staff was too large. But we need more government in some areas, probably. We need less government in other areas. We just need a different way of going about government. And to me, I'll just end with one point. Basically, every time I hear Mr. Tier say we can't get rid of a post because that will mean 15,000 paid out from the social care system, that's completely the wrong way of looking at it. I can't believe that nobody picks him up on it more. Basically, the value of a post is the value of a post. And if the post is only worth that and it costs that, get rid of the post. I'm not talking about redundancies, I'm talking about flexibility of working. I'm not talking about affecting people, I'm talking about making a better government. And that's what being a public representative is all about. Working with the staff in the departments to work out how they can do their job better and working out how we can do things differently, just as the government now says in its agenda for change and in its priorities and in its scope report response. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Dawson on the same question regarding scope of government.
Yeah, I'd like to tackle this from a different angle than Chris, who's covered the central administration, and perhaps widen the discussion a little bit. Let's take Douglas Town Council. 18 town councillors and 8 MHKs in Douglas, 26 elected members who serve approximately, it's 1,001 elected person per 1,000 head of population. Is that too big? I think that may be a little bit of over-government. Part of the scope was to look at local town councils and local commissioners. So, for example, in Ramsey, you have Ramsey Town Commissioners. There was the move to bring in the likes of Jerby and Andreas and Regaby and all those outlying commissioners into one in Ramsey. And likewise, you then would have 4 major commissioners or town councils on the Isle of Man, namely Ramsey, Peel, Douglas, and I think one in the south, probably Port St Mary, and I think I'm in favour of that. I think where it has hit a bit of a hiccup, though, is that obviously it would need those commissioners to actually vote themselves out of office and slim themselves down, and a lot of local people do believe in having their local commissioners. So it's something I know that the Chief Minister commented on a recent roaming Coleman, where he said this seems to go round and round and round again. We never really seem to get to it. So I think we've really got to make a decision, and we've got to talk about this, but we've really got to make, I think, an example somewhere. And one of the examples I would quite like to look at, it's all very well looking at civil servants and knocking civil servants down, but a lot of people I speak to on the doorstep are concerned about the salaries of MHKs, the fact that they don't contribute to their pensions, and the fact that they pick up extra money on the various committees. So I think that also needs to be looked at in conjunction with any scaling down in other areas of government.
Thank you. And finally, for that question on the scope of government, Mr. Gill.
Thank you. I think we have to look at our recent history. Over the last 20, 30 years, the Isle of Man has enjoyed unprecedented growth, unprecedented quality of life and economic benefits which have not been distributed fairly and evenly, but nonetheless have been enjoyed to some degree by everybody in the Isle of Man. And if, for those of us who are old enough to remember, we think back not that long ago to the 70s when we had huge unemployment. Before that we had winter work schemes. Before that we had people having to leave the island because there was no work. These things don't just happen. And I think what government has done, and it's a reflection, and a natural reflection in many ways, is say we want to increase the services we provide. At that same time, public expectation about those services, public demand and clamour for those services improved. And at the same time, members of Tynwald, members of the public service generally, were being held more and more to account, so the bureaucracy grew with that. So we cannot sustain the situation which has been allowed, not for bad reasons altogether, but for understandable reasons. We cannot sustain government in the form and the size it is. So what did the last government do? They were faced with this. They had two choices. They could look at restructuring government, and they could look at the scope of government. What does government actually do, and should it continue doing those things? All they did was look at the former. They restructured without knowing what the outcome was going to be. In my opinion, in my manifesto, I call that a cynical distraction to buy time for the last election. And all it's done is lost years and been divisive and expensive. This government has to learn from that experience. This government has to look at the scope of government. It has to look at value added from every post within the public service. It has to look at options. I'm heavily involved in lots of charitable organisations. We can provide a much more flexible, much more cost-effective, and in many cases, equally, if not higher quality service to lots of areas that government is currently involved in. That's what the government has to look at. Now, we're told that they're looking at that. I hope that that's true. I hope that the Agenda for Change programme, which is the overarching programme that describes in headline terms what needs to be done, is actually a meaningful document. But it will not have any value, and it will have no purpose if government is not going to make some courageous and sometimes unpopular decisions. Unpopular with everybody in this room. And the kind of politician that will make that decision is somebody who says, I want to earn your respect, not just your popularity. Respect is what we need, and leadership is what we need, and we need it now. And that's the challenge government has, because government, in all its forms, is not sustainable as it is.
Thank you. That's the fourth answer to the question on the scope of government. And the next question, question number 4, which will be answered firstly by Mr. Thomas, is: do you agree with the suggestion that the murderer of PC's Fiona Bone and Nicola Hughes should get a whole life sentence? Should this also apply to the murderers of all public servants?
Thank you. This is a very serious issue, and you'll be pleased to know that my answer for this question will be slightly shorter than my last one. Thought that would get a laugh, I'm sorry. Mr. Dawson, I just wanted to clarify, because obviously we're in a position of being public representatives, and what we say is listened to. I just wanted to clarify. I think I heard you say that committee members in Parliament get paid for being on the committee, because I don't think that's true. Although that isn't true. So isn't true. I mean,
committee members?
Well, I think you said I think you said that Parliament committee members get paid for being on committees, and they don't get any paid.
Yes. I stand corrected.
Because that's a very important point. So it's important to actually have the facts agreed before we discuss what we should do next and so on. Because there are some members in Parliament who don't get the 11,000 that pretty much everybody else gets, because they're not in government. They're only doing an incredibly hard-working job in scrutiny and policy review. In terms of this very serious issue of the local lady who was murdered serving as a public servant, the tragedy. Sentencing is, we have precedent on sentencing. We have judges comparing things, and it's not for a politician at this stage to comment on without full facts on either the generality of that sentencing or the individual circumstances. Obviously, despite what I said earlier about policemen, the legal system, the law enforcement, all the other public servants deserve the complete trust and the complete support of politicians, and that's the way I would approach that sort of suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. And Mr. Dawson, please.
Thank you. I think we need to define public servants. I'm assuming they possibly might mean police officers, emergency services, as opposed to public servants. I'm not sure if that's what the question I had in mind, but that's part of my answer. I don't know, again, what does whole life sentence mean? Quite often these people are sentenced to what we in America is life. Quite often life in the United Kingdom, when they're sentenced, doesn't actually mean life. It means something like 30 or 40, or in this case I think 37 years. I wasn't quite sure of the exact number of years. I think this opens a wider discussion into the death penalty. and I'd like to raise that. It's an issue that people perhaps don't want to talk about, but let's raise whether this shouldn't be a life sentence, it should be something more substantial. And the problem is, if we widen that to the death penalty, that there are two problems with the death penalty. Some people might say they agree with the death penalty for murders of such incidents as this, but what restricts it is the judicial system, and that we can't guarantee that those who are accused of the crime actually did it. So I think that's a debate we actually need to have. But in this case, again, we don't know all the facts, but I am one for heavy judicial sentences. I am one for punishment that fits the crime. That's really where the stance I come from. So in essence, not knowing the full facts, I would agree wholeheartedly with the sentence.
Thank you. And Mr. Gill, please.
Thank you. As a former probation officer, you might be not be surprised to hear me say that I fundamentally disagree with what Chris has just said. The premise that he agrees with heavy judicial punishments and the punishment fitting the crime. The two things are not the same thing. They are contradictory. The last Labour government under Tony Blair in 2003 to 2010 introduced more criminal legislation in that narrow period than any other government in the whole of the 19th century. It is an absolute, the criminal justice system in Britain, and that's persuasive on the Isle of Man, has gone hill-to-kilter. In the last election, and Mr Murcott at the back will recall this because he was a very active supporter of those of us who opposed a draconian criminal justice system bill that would have given the police absolutely unnecessary and unfettered and unwarranted powers. So even in the Isle of Man, we are affected by what goes on in the UK. The question is, should we have whole life sentences? We do have whole life sentences. If somebody is convicted of a murder, they are convicted for life. They might be released from custody, but they can be recalled if they commit a further offence or if their behaviour is a threat. Now, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing is a moot point. The important point is we have to manage the criminal justice system in a more appropriate method that gets us away from imprisoning people earlier and for longer and for less serious crimes than any other country in Europe. Is that necessary? I don't believe so. Does it work? No, it definitely doesn't, because recidivism rates are higher in the UK than they are in many other countries. Detection rates are actually lower. They're higher in the Isle of Man, and I give the police absolute credit for that. But the criminal justice system that we are emulating in the UK does not work. It is not fit for purpose, and far from making it stronger and tougher and more draconian and more heavy-handed, we should actually be looking at making sure that we get people to avoid custody, to absolutely engage in programmes and activities which mean they have to actually pay back to the community and give them a stake in the community, so they actually will desist from reoffending because they have an interest in it, a vested interest. So should we have a whole life sentence where you have got no chance of getting out of prison ever anyway? If any of you were in that unhappy position, what would you have to lose? Would you be a model prisoner? Would you make prisons a better place for those people that we send in there earlier for less serious sentences? No. Prison will be an even worse place. It will be an even more damaging experience for more and more people. That can't be good. That cannot be good. And a whole life sentence would impose that. The sentencing we have at the moment is important because it has one key factor. As far as we can, we should depoliticise the criminal justice system, and we should trust our deemsters. We should trust our bailiffs and our judges. That's their duty, and that we should honour what their decisions are.
Thank you. At the beginning of your answer, Mr. Gill, you made a reference to the question that was answered by Chris. It was, in fact, answered by Clive.
Sorry.
Thank you very much.
And the last for this question is Mr. Skinner.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to agree with Mr. Gill. The short answer is, and I presume it's in custody, the short answer is yes. I mean, public servants do a job. Part of the attraction of the job is you go to work, you don't know where you're going to be within 5 minutes of starting work. Here we have a man who deliberately set out to kill these police officers. And, to sort of agree with Mr. Gill that, he should be kept and then released from prison. No, I don't think so. Because the man has sort of committed other crimes in the past, and I think the only place for him actually is prison. Again, it opens up the debate of capital punishment, but as Clive said, we won't go there. And I think there are other crimes as well, such as arson, has to be looked at for attempted murder. So yes, I would agree that life means life, and life behind bars. So
Thank you. Thank you very much. That completes the fourth question, and now we'll start back at the beginning again with Mr. Dawson. And the question is, Mr. Dawson and the other members, potential members, if you are not successful next week, will you stand in any other by-elections which may arise? Mr. Dawson,
Thank you very much indeed. I took some time to write my manifesto. I gave it a long thought. I consulted various people in the community. So I've laid myself open, and my policies and my views, and I think are fairly clear to everybody where I stand. They won't change in 3.5 years. For me personally, I'm offering myself to the electorate on this occasion, and if they say yes, I'll be delighted. If they say no, I shall be disappointed, but I shall get on my way, and no, I won't stand in any other by-elections.
Thank you. Mr. Gill, please.
I know what it's like to be elected to the House of Keys, and it is a huge honour. I know what it's like to not be elected to the House of Keys, and it's a bitter disappointment. If it wasn't, you shouldn't be standing. So for any candidate who will be put off by one setback, I would say be resolute. If you believe this, if you believe that you are going to represent your constituency, your community, to the best of your abilities, then have the courage of your convictions. Now that's my commitment to go into public service as a social worker, as a probation officer, and as a politician. You have to accept that there will be winners. There are times you win arguments, there are times you win elections, there are times you lose. But don't be put off. So to answer the question directly, would I stand in another by-election? I've had to take leave of absence to stand in this by-election, so I hope it doesn't come round too quickly, because I can't afford another one. but if I could, and I would make that effort, then yes, I would, if I felt that by doing so, I could be a good representative for that constituency. But that would only be a constituency in Douglas. And my constituency that I want to live in, I want to serve, is Douglas West.
Thank you. And Mr. Skinner, please.
Thank you. What would I do? Well, I've always made great thing of the fact that I believe it's important that one lives within the constituency that one represents. Being born, brought up in West Douglas and lived in West Douglas all my life, for me, this isn't a convenient by-election. If I'm not successful, then I will continue to represent 50% of West Douglas, those that live in Murray's ward on Douglas Council.
Thank you. Mr. Thomas, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good answers from my colleagues, and concur. I'll carry on with pleasure, because it's a privilege to represent the other 50% of Douglas West as a councillor. And I agree with John Gill. It is actually quite a great cost. Touche, yeah, we're equal now. That was deliberate. Timing is what it's about in comedy and politics, I understand. So that's it. With Quintin there, I agree, it's very expensive to stand for an election. So why do you do it? Well, I'm not going to answer the question directly, because for two reasons. First of all, I called my website, on which my manifesto is and has been for some time, www.IoM2020.im. Okay? I care about the priorities for government that I've put onto my manifesto. So if I wasn't a candidate, I would still be supporting the policies in here in 2 years' time, when there might be LegCo by-elections, in 3 years' time, in 4 years' time, in 5 years' time. So that's the point. I mean, when you stand for election, to me, it's not only about you standing, it's about the policies and the programme, and I'd be delighted to work with other people, or if there was another by-election in Douglas West, or, of course, the first thing that we'll be asked to consider in June, Tynwald, is the new constituencies. And, you know, if it goes ahead as currently proposed, I'll be living in Douglas West. I only live one house outside at the moment, but if it goes ahead in June, I'll be living inside Douglas West, because Douglas West will be losing Tremode, and it will be taking in Tynwald, St George's, and key polling districts. So I'll be able to say to John next time, if we both stand, I represent 65% of Douglas Central, 35%.
Thank you very much. Mr. Dawson, oh no, you started off on that question. So we're now moving on to Mr. Gill for the next question, which is, some see the current waiting lists at our hospital as unacceptable. Do you agree? So current waiting lists at the hospital are unacceptable. Do you agree?
Everybody who is on a hospital waiting list will understandably and reasonably think that the waiting list for their condition to be treated is too long. That's a given. There have been some very successful initiatives to address particularly challenging and long waiting lists, and I think government and the department are to be commended for undertaking those. However, there will never be an occasion where instant access to all services will be achievable. I wish there could be, but we are already investing very, very heavily in the hospital and the health service generally, and we will never find an occasion where the waiting lists are absolutely what everybody wants, which is immediate and top quality treatment. And now I work in the hospital. I know this on a daily basis, that people have those frustrations. I can understand them. There are all sorts of issues facing the health service. And what I have to say, though, is within the best of the resources we have, my experience of the hospital is that the staff almost invariably are wholeheartedly committed to providing the best service they can. And that's not just the nurses, it's not just the medical staff, it's actually the administrative staff, it's all the support staff that work with them. And I, for one, am very proud to work in the health service in the hospital, because I think whilst we can never achieve everything that we would like, we do achieve what we can with the resources that we have.
Thank you, Mr. Gill. For Mr. Skinner, the current waiting lists at our hospital are unacceptable. Do you agree?
Yes, what Quintin just said, it depends. If you've got something wrong with you, then any wait is obviously a long time. I know that there are two areas where cause within the health service has arisen are orthopaedics and dermatology. And there are two, again within that, there are two main areas, there's routine and the medical. And I do know that if someone on the routine list has problems and becomes an emergency, then they go onto the medical list and they are seen fairly quickly, I would say. Yes, there are initiatives, but the problem if they do initiatives, they do some on ENT at Ramsey, but they clear the backlog and 12 months later the backlog is there again. So initiatives do work, but they're only a quick fix for a short period. Would new theatres help, or a new theatre? Yes, it might, but again, there's a cost implication on that, because if you open a new theatre, you need more staff. If you appoint a consultant, you need probably at least 6 more staff. But I think, apart from those two areas, the waiting lists at the moment are acceptable, but again, if you need to see somebody, then it probably isn't.
Thank you. And Mr. Thomas, please.
Thank you, Chairman. It's an incredibly difficult subject, and if John has explained the facts, and I'll draw from those facts and make some observations. The fact is that dermatology, as I understand it, is an incredibly long waiting list, and orthopaedics I think is supposed to be 20 weeks, and the point I wanted to make is that I find lots of people don't actually believe that figure of 20 weeks. So where I would go from what you've just said, John, is two things. The first one is that, you know, managing expectations is the way in the modern world, and, you know, managing expectations is the way to approach waiting lists. The orthopaedics, as I understand it, to get 20 weeks includes both types, and if you've got something that's not, you know, medical, it's going to be a lot longer than 20 weeks. So why don't we encourage our health service and our hospital to be, and our consultants and the rest of our very valuable staff to be more transparent and tell us more and to engage with us more? That's the first point I wanted to make. And the second one is that essentially it's an input-output approach, as Mr. Dawson said on thing. You know, we have a finite amount of resources. And from what I hear in my role as the Health Services Consultative Committee, that amount of resources is collapsing in the hospital, and it's going to be touch and go whether we can keep it going. So therefore, we need to support the staff there with every little way to actually make the whole process more efficient and effective. And, 20 weeks, we have to rely on, and I suppose the last point, I said two, but the last point I wanted to make is the way I perceive it, having had only 4 months in the role so far, is that part of the issue is data in the health service. So somehow we've got to empower people to actually have data inside the hospital and the health service about consultants and procedures as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Thomas and Mr. Dawson.
Are we standing or sitting for questions? Is it
It's up to yourself, sir.
Okay, I'll stand. Thank you very much.
You please address the floor how you would like to.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it is a delicate issue. But what are the waiting lists? Normally, when you have a problem, you have to identify what the problem is and what areas in which the problem are, and then you can come up with a whole list of potential solutions. The fact of the matter is that right now, something like, I think, 1/5 of all government expenditure is on health, and are we going to be able to afford any more? Quite often when I've experienced problems such as this, you should go to the ground floor to ask out what the best solutions are. Quite often it's not management that know the best solutions, but it's the people working day to day on the ground who actually know the best way to overcome some of these problems that we have. One of the problems is, dare I say, that we take the health service for granted. Although we pay into it, we do take it for granted. And I think that people sometimes, don't attend appointments, they don't go to the doctor or attend these sessions, and that is hugely expensive. So I think there needs to be a tightening up perhaps on there, and a more commitment maybe from us to make sure that we attend appointments and help these people do their job. But again, with the health service, the people I've spoken to on the street in Douglas West and in some of the houses, which there are nurses there, they tend to point upwards and say this system can be reviewed, it can work, but so often it's management that's blocking some very simple systems that could be put in place in order to try our best to rectify the situation, but it is not easy. I think also perhaps we should be looking at price. Can we get these services somewhere else? I mean, there's a market out there should be a commercial market. I know it's expensive to fly people away and get people to England, but is there a better way of doing things? Is there a more cost-effective way of doing things? Is it better to bring consultants over here and for 6 months and do all those operations there? There's got to be ways of looking at it, and there's got to be a better way of organising this in order to reduce these waiting lists accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question is, what are your views on the recent government decision to abandon the plans regarding the renewable energy target of 2015? And that's Mr. Skinner, please, to start.
Thank you. I think it's probably wrong to abandon it. Perhaps it should have been kept under constant review is perhaps a better way to go. The original target was a very ambitious target set at the outset anyway, I think. But government should be looking at new ways of producing green energy. And for instance, I recently attended a presentation on a scheme to extract biofuel from seaweed. And this could be, I'm not saying it can be done easily, but there's cost implications to the ratepayers here because A, we'd get the beach cleaned, and we'd save money as ratepayers by not having to see a man going up and down the promenade in with a tractor, pushing the seaweed back into the sea, to sit and watch it come back again, and to push it out again. So I think, again, yes, it should be under review, and I think the government is wrong to abandon it totally.
Thank you. Mr Thomas.
You know, abandoning a target is the same as missing a target. So in that sense, I would have to agree with John, which you know, we might as well be honest that we've missed the target. You know, the basic issue we have in the island is that we have 6 generation sources of electricity. We really don't need any more electricity. We've got a couple of generators at Pool Rose. We've got Ramsey, we've got Peel, we've got Solby, we've got the got a massive great cable that goes in, and so on. The great beauty about that methane, anaerobic digestion methane presentation that we organised for the public in I suppose it's about a month ago now, is that that methane doesn't produce electricity, it goes into the process of producing electricity. So it's better than windmill for that reason, even if there are no other reasons. You know, gas, by common consensus, is about to explode in price and value. You know, there's nothing we can do about it. There's getting less and less of these fuels that are not renewable. So, you know, until 2023, we have a contractual arrangement to bring gas in through the pipeline, a very expensive arrangement. You know, there's got to be some explanation why we've got 400 million of debt at the MEA, and a sizable portion of that is all of the gas pipelines. But the great beauty of this methane from anaerobic digestion, and we could get methane from anaerobic digestion of our sewage as well, and that's one of my proposals in my manifesto, to revisit the 40 million we're spending on the regional IRIS scheme to see whether we can think about these sorts of things. But anyhow, what I'm saying is, you know, meeting a target is also how you go about classifying what meets the target. And perhaps there's something clever we can do about saying, you know, electricity generated at Pool Rose is actually renewable if it's in part got a bit of seaweed gas inside it. You know, that's what everybody else does. That's what the big bold politicians in big bold countries do that Mr Dawson was talking about. You know, they redefine the terms when they're about to miss a target. And that's what we've got to be doing. Rather than running around looking for windmills or whatever, perhaps we can redefine the terms. And I agree with John, seaweed is a very, very valuable source, and that's why I was pleased recently, in the last couple of weeks, to be appointed to be on the committee actually observing that research that's going on for the next 2 years in France and Ireland, and now in the Isle of Man. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr Dawson, please.
Sure. I think, yes, the target has been missed. And I think it may have been missed because we're looking backwards at technologies to provide renewable energy that are frankly out of date. You know, there's a lot of people now saying that wind farms aren't perhaps as efficient or as cost effective as once was thought. So I agree with the speakers who've said we should look at other more futuristic forms of providing energy. One interesting point is if you produce your own energy, it's very difficult to put it into the grid, and even then you'll be on a different tariff. So if you live by a river and you want to produce your own renewable energy for yourself and maybe put the excess into the grid, there are certain restrictions on that. So I think there is certain legislation in place which needs removing in order to encourage forms of renewable energy, in order to help us offset our reliance on the carbon fuels that we burn so readily.
Thank you very much, Mr Dawson. And finally, Mr Gill, please, for your comments on abandoning the renewable energy target.
I think the real question is not should we have had the target of 2015, 15%. My view at the time, and I made it very clear, I was chairman of the MEA at the time, was this has been picked. These figures have been picked because they rhyme. That's all. You'll just click 15% out, 2015, that rhymes, that's good enough. It was based on ideology, it was based on a wishfulness to be green and to be doing our bit. Now, I don't take issue with being as green as we can, but I think we have to build in the 2 factors that need to be core to that consideration. One is economics, and the other is technology. Now, the only technology we could have introduced, even if the timescale was achievable, and it wasn't, was a wind turbine, an onshore wind turbine. And we've heard about the intermittency, we've heard about all the other costs of spinning reserve to cover up for the 70% downtime on wind turbines. But even if we could have done that, the cost would have been to you as bill payers to the MEA, to the monopoly of the MEA. And I personally, let me say, think that the MEA and utilities should be in public ownership. But the cost of 15, whatever it was at the time, pence per unit, would have had to rise to something nearer 23 pence per unit. For business, and electricity is the foundation of our business. The reason we have a banking sector here is because they have secure electricity and it's affordable. The reason we have an e-gaming business here is because we have affordable and secure electricity. It would not be affordable at 23 pence. The Chamber of Commerce were telling us this, but the motion was driven by ideology. It was never achievable anyway in the time scale, and it's disappointing that it's been dropped, but I do commend government for at least having the candour to say we weren't going to do it, it can't be done, we'll make other motions to make ourselves as eco-friendly as we can be. But they all have to have the key considerations of economy and technology. And we've heard some ideas, that's all they are, about how we can introduce new technologies into it. I'm not an engineer. I don't think any of us are engineers. But we should be open to those thoughts, but we should have the key considerations. Are they affordable and are they technically proven? Because the last thing we want to be in the Isle of Man is a test bed for something that ties us into a system which is unworkable and costly.
Thank you, Mr. Gill. The 8th question is, and listen carefully, if the government took the moral high ground and paid MHK's pensions in full from the last election, could this help to overcome the bus strikes? So if the government took the moral high ground and paid MHK's pensions in full from the last election, could this help to overcome the bus strikes? Mr. Thomas, to go first, please.
So my understanding of the question, it's always the way to do it, to define the question, is if the cost of MHK pensions was calculated, would that cover what we need to save on an annual basis to not have the 300,000 at dispute with the bus drivers? Is that good enough a definition of the question? So let me think. As far as I understand it, from the statement, the actuarial statement, which is published, I think, for the first time this year following changes to the financial reporting standards. So we now have the full actuarial statement in public. Congratulations to the government. I think the contribution you're paying to MHKs was 44% when it was done, 44% of their annual salary, and I think the contribution is up to 5%, so it will have gone down to around 40%. So there are 33 of them. Let's take 50,000 as an underestimate. So that's 40% of 50,000 is 20,000. There are 33 of them. So I think that's more than 300,000, isn't it? So I think the answer is yes.
Thank you. Mr. Dawson, would you like to see if you could better that?
No, I think I'll say thanks to Chris, and I totally agree.
Oh, right. Thank you. And Mr. Gill, please.
Well, I think that's probably one of the most convoluted questions I've heard in a public meeting.
The answer
is probably. But it's missing the point. The point is, why have we got a bus strike? The point is, how much does it cost to pay that? And we need to look at alternative mechanisms. Where we've got this impasse, we need to look at alternative ways, tried and proven ways of resolving disputes. Conciliation should be a requirement. You can't make people conciliate, but you can make them attend to conciliation, and if they don't, the tribunal that settles ultimately will have to settle disputes should consider that as a factor. there are going to be, if the bus strike is a challenging issue, there will be, whoever is elected, there will be further questions that you will have to think, how are we going to save this money? And your priorities and the person sitting next to you's priorities will be different. And none of you will be entirely happy with the outcomes. But that's the reality that's facing your next MHK, your current MHK, John Sherman, and his government, our government. And we can't put it off. So the point might be right about juggling money around, but the fundamental point is we are going to face some unpleasant decisions, and we need to face up to them.
Thank you, Mr. Gill. And finally for this question, Mr. Skinner.
Well, like everybody else, I can't beat Chris's answer, but I don't, the bus driver strike has come about as a result of, I don't know what would be seen now as bad management, but it was in days of plenty where there was money available for everything. And if someone came to you and said, here you go, here's £60 if you'll be on call for your dinner hour, I don't think anybody in this room would say, sorry boss, that's far too much money for me, I couldn't take that. But now they're being asked to take it back. But I agree, you know, it should be renegotiated, and I think everybody should go back to stage one and try and renegotiate from a sensible level to try and sort out what's going to happen. Because otherwise we're going to be faced with more strikes.
Thank you, Mr. Skinner. The 9th question is, do you think that this government should introduce a Freedom of Information Act? And if yes, what will you do to ensure that it will happen? Mr. Dawson, please.
Again, on the doorstep, for me, this has been raised by several people, should there be a Freedom of Information Act. The Freedom of Information Act in UK has very strict guidelines, and it's very hard to follow. It follows very strict guidelines of when answers have to be given. And unfortunately, although we might want it, it does cost a great deal of money to actually implement. So what do we do instead? Well, I am used to, my background is phased implementation, and I think it would be possible that we have a Freedom of Information Act in due course. But I think a first step to that would be some form of ombudsman, which has been mooted for a long time within the Isle of Man, and perhaps increasing that role. It's people on the doorstep are concerned. They're concerned about the Sefton Hotel and where that money went. They're concerned about the Manx Electricity Authority. They're concerned about Pinewood Film Studios, and they are concerned about decisions made in government which they feel are not transparent and they don't understand them. So my first phase would be having this ombudsman who is the focal point for complaints, and at that stage, over a period of time, we could assess the requirement. Are there widespread complaints? Are there hundreds, tens, thousands? And in this way we could then monitor that with a view to bringing in perhaps something of a Manx Freedom of Information Act, which is particularly moulded to the needs of the Isle of Man, rather than just, as we sometimes do, taking an act from England or Scotland or Wales and blistering it on here without due consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Gill, please.
Thank you. I said earlier in relation to an unrelated bill, an unrelated legislation, secondary legislation, the first question is, why do we need this? And in the UK they introduced the Freedom of Information Act. You probably sense my disdain for Tony Blair and a lot of the harm and damage he did. One of the regrets he has is introducing the Freedom of Information Act, because he did it in naivety. He was trying to placate people who felt that they had a right to every bit of information that the government were considering, even the sensitive policy development. My argument will be, why do we need a Freedom of Information Act? It's not about having an ombudsman to deal with complaints. An ombudsman deals with maladministration. That's a separate issue. This is about accessing information. And the government is committed to introducing the Freedom of Information Act, and I commend them to a degree for that. It will be bureaucratic, it will be costly, and it won't answer the fundamental question, why do we need it? We need it because some people feel they are entitled and deserve information about government's thinking. And I agree with that to a degree. To a degree. But nobody has the right to know all the thinking and all the workings of government. Others will disagree with that, and no doubt we'll hear a contrary view. But my opinion is we do not need a Freedom of Information Act, particularly in a small community, if we had a government that was more open and more respectful of answering questions and dealing and explaining their thinking and their actions to the public they serve. And there is a lot of scope for improvement. That's the feeling I've had on the doors. I've knocked on nearly every door in this constituency, and I will knock on every door before the election. But the consistent view I've had is government is not conveying its message. We don't understand what they're doing. We don't understand why they're doing it. But I don't think that that automatically means that we need to have a Freedom of Information Act.
Thank you. And Mr Skinner, please.
Well, Quintin's just stole my line there about Tony Blair. Tony Blair said that freedom of information was the worst thing that he ever introduced. The last administration that we had in the House of Keys were bad because they didn't communicate anything really. But at least this new, latest administration is at least going some way towards communicating more with the public. We've seen the introduction of the Roman Coman meetings that we've had, which are, I would say, for the Isle of Man, reasonably well attended. But I don't think it goes far enough. And as Clive alluded to there, the Sefton, each day there's a little bit more comes out, which makes it easier to understand. And if I can go back, or sort of revert to council, we have public meetings and we have private meetings. And there are things which are in those private meetings which shouldn't be made public until the time is right. But eventually everything that's discussed in the private meetings is made public. And that's as close as I think you'll get to a freedom of information. Because there are things that go on which, for obvious reasons, have to be kept confidential until the time is right that they become public.
Thank you, Mr Skinner. And finally, for this question, it's Mr Thomas.
John, the council is much better now after a year of us being in it and a year of Bill Malarkey, but 2012 it wasn't at all like you describe it. It's only beginning to come like you say. So for instance, one of my manifesto commitments in the Our Town part is something the executive, because that's what we have in the council, we have 5 in the executive and then we have the rest of us. The executive said they would look into actually doing something which I would have thought is a fundamental right in a democracy. They will think about publishing, telling us all, you know, when they're having a private meeting and when we're having a private meeting. So John and I know when there's a private meeting, but none of you know. I don't even know when there's a private meeting of the committee that John's on. John doesn't know when there's a private meeting of the committee I'm on. And you know, it used to be the case in the council that there was one little bit of private information and around it was lots and lots of public information. And to be fair to the executive, we now often have 2 items on the agenda. But what my proposal was, which is what executive is thinking, is that at least the title of the private agenda items should be in public, so we can at least know what it is they've got private information about that they're not talking about. Richard McNichol disagrees, but you know, that's being considered by the executive. He's on the executive and it seems like they won't be taking that forward. In terms of the actual question, it's a similar answer. Yes, you know, there's no cost in the Freedom of Information. My understanding is it's drafted already and it is a Manx Freedom of Information Act and they can just bring it in. But, you know, so I will vote for it to be brought in. I cannot see the cost that's envisaged arising from it. And what I would say is, in actual fact, we have got, and I agree with John, we've got processes in place inside government that are in the right direction and I would encourage them. So for instance, you know, it would be better if we had policy debates and it would be better if we had annual reports, but at least having a website that actually gives us what the targets are and what the performance is, www.gov.im, even though it's in beta form, is a good thing. I would say that for the freedom of information, the first point that we have to do is we have to imagine how it will be used, how it will be put in place. And I basically think the Data Protection Office is a pretty good example. So I would say in my manifesto we've got data protection, Auditor General, Ombudsman, freedom of information, and I reckon the data protection and the freedom of information could do together, and to me the data protection officer's got a good track record and the office has got a good track record, and that's something how we would go about it. And my last point is, in a way, the public needs to be involved because we're your representatives, but parliamentarians need to be involved, and to be frank, because the parliamentary process has got better in recent years, and because the policy review committees have come in, and there are some good members of those who are asking lots of questions, and because it's moved out, there are lots of written questions being asked, and it's not just for publicity in the oral questions at the beginning of the House and Keys and Tynwald. To be frank, the need for a Freedom of Information Act is going away slightly, because we have got the signs are that the Parliament is getting better, and I would be part of that move to make the Parliament better so that there's more information and we don't have this view formed in the public that what's the point, we don't know what's going on and we can't trust what's going on, and so on and so on. And the last point is that we also have this system of statutory committees, and I serve on two. I'm on the one that's going to consider legal aid reform, and that's valuable, I think, because it's members of the public who get a chance to have slightly superior information. That's the view at the moment, and the health service likewise. So I think at the moment we've got too many layers, and we can, and in the coming years we can review it. But to me, the freedom of information is a fundamental part of it, and Manx freedom of information, just like Mr. Dawson wanted.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. And the 10th and last written question is: when young people are unemployed, why do the MEA employ retired firemen and don't about police? So, I'm only reading what's written. When young people are unemployed, why do the MEA employ retired firemen? Stop. And don't about police.
Must be a point at you, John.
Maybe the questioner means that retired policemen aren't employed. I don't know. It's up to the candidates tonight here to interpret the question. When young people are unemployed, why do the MEA employ retired firemen and don't about police? And Mr. Gill, please.
Well, I frankly can't understand the question and I can't answer it. What I can say is, if that individual would like to speak to me, and I'm sure the other candidates, we'd be happy to do that.
Maybe he's implying that you need policemen to look into the MEA fiasco.
Maybe. I think that's a charitable interpretation. I think what I would say is, I mentioned earlier, I'm the former chairman of the MEA. The MEA now is held up as an exemplar of good governance. We are cited to the other boards as the model of how the board and the committees that underpin that board's work should be run. We apply ourselves now to the Nolan principles of public service, and I think the MEA of today, compared to the MEA where there was no political representation, let alone chairman, at the time that the unauthorised borrowings were made. So the point I make is there is a role for politicians, and that role has a value, and you can judge that in the experience of the MEA. I'm sorry I can't answer the point about employment. What I would say is I'd be surprised that the MEA are employing anybody's, frankly, because we're cutting staff numbers quite considerably, including senior management. During my time, we cut 40% of our directors, which saved a significant amount of money. We paid the chief executive, who is now serving, who is an excellent officer. We paid him considerably less than his predecessor, and we didn't lose anything in terms of quality and commitment in that appointment process. And I think that process that's been applied in the MEA, which is a bit more business-like than the rest of the public service, but those models that I undertook and I led as the chairman can actually be replicated across the public service. So at a time when we're advertising for chief officers who are paid significantly more than their counterparts in the United Kingdom, and of course, like all of us, pay significantly less tax, I think the moral is we need to look sometimes at the MEA as exemplars of good practice and reflect that across the wider public service. That's a challenge for government, and they don't seem keen to actually reflect that from my experience. But if I'm elected, I will promote that and I will progress that.
Thank you very much. And Mr Skinner, please.
Well, no, I don't understand part of the question either. It's 13 years since I left the fire service. I don't know what the job is referred to, or what the job is that's being referred to. Neither do I know the retired fire officer that's being referred to. I have very little contact with anybody within the fire service now. My closest association is with a very good friend of mine who is also retired, and we sort of socialise together. Again, I suppose it's employers' choice, but having said that, employers should be encouraged to take young people on, and why not? You can train them, you've got them for a long time. But why anybody should employ anybody and what this refers to, I don't know. And as Quintin said, if someone would like to discuss it with me later, I'm only too happy to do so.
Thank you, Mr Skinner. And Mr Thomas, please, for your view.
Leaving aside Mr Aston's view about the MEA and comments about MEA past and future, just to focus on two dimensions of the question. The first one is the youth aspect, and the second one is the aspect of the public officers who do a very wonderful job and have the issue about, and we all have the issue about, pensions and retiring at 50. And I'll start with the second one first. I mean, if you're a policeman, you can't, or a probation officer, or I should think, or working up at the prison, the requirements and the demands of the job change. And historically, that was why we ended up with differential retirement ages, and that's a huge issue. So what we need is we need somebody, and we need a group of people inside our Parliament to actually work in coming years to address all these issues about making the pensions affordable when they're paid to staff early, and that might include flexibility of working and what people do if they're working in the police and if they're working in the prison and so on after they finish doing the job that they can on just getting older grounds, and nothing. It's a very big issue. It's a very big issue. And the second one is, people talk about 50% of groups being underemployed, and one of those groups is younger people, and that's a serious issue. So anybody who's going in to take a job that younger people can do, we've got to, from a society's point of view, we need politicians who take that seriously and investigate it over a number of years. So in conclusion, MEA's employment practices, because it's a statutory board and because it's so much related to what the state does, are important. They're obviously an issue for the board and the management of the MEA, but I would like to think that in society and through society's representation through Parliament, we would actually take into account the massive issues we've got about the fact that fire service pensions cost nearly as much as the MHK's pensions for the state because of the early retirement, as do they cost a lot more than teachers and health service workers, because there's no real reason why you need to you retire early in teaching and health work. So there's a great difference in the cost to the state of the pensions, which we need to address through flexibility and through investigation in coming years.
Thank you very much, Mr Thomas. And finally, Mr Dawson, if you'd like to sum this one to the end.
Well, I'll just interpret it my own way. I think we should have raised the MEA. People are still asking where this, I think it was £140 million came from. I think you're entitled to raise that issue. I think it still needs awaiting answers for that. Sorry, Dominic? 160. And
I would be interested to know as to why the government did not throw that back.
Excuse me, sir, could we just keep with the written questions at this moment in time, and oral questions will be coming up next, as this is the last written one and Mr Dawson's the last person to answer. Okay. Thank you, sir.
So, but I do need that. I think the MEA has got to be allowed to employ the people they need with the skills they need for any jobs they have. That's the open market. But let's tackle the youth unemployment. There are many young people now unemployed in the Isle of Man, and they're pretty cheesed off about it. I welcome the NEETS initiative and also the national insurance holidays that have been offered at the moment, and a lot of the young people are now getting this work experience in various companies across the island, which I think is really good. What I would say though is there's another initiative, and I have spoken to some people about this, where we now need to get specific training for the jobs that are available. And it may be that some of the young people who want to be a certain job, like accountants or whatever else, or something else, may have to lower their vision somewhat and maybe be trained for some of the jobs that are available. And in my manifesto, I've said that this is what I would support. There are a great deal of jobs available in the service industries. And traditionally, in the last few years, we have filled those vacancies with people from overseas who come here and who do contribute to the economy. But wouldn't it be better if we take our core local unemployed and train them to get the vacancies that are currently available on the Isle of Man? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dawson. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the submission of written questions, of which there were 10. I'd now like to invite oral questions from the floor. And if you'd like to speak, please direct your question through the chair and raise your hand. Yes, sir, over in the corner there.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the people standing for their views so far, which I found interesting. Well, what I'd like to ask, since we all know the government that needs to cut back on expenditure, is perhaps we can name one specific area that you think the government should be cutting back in.
Thank you very much. And would anybody particularly like to?
Yes, I would. Yes, I would.
Mr. Dawson, thank you.
I have been criticised on this particular issue, so I will raise it. It's the personal tax allowance tax rebate, basically, which basically says that if you earn under 9,350 or whatever the tax threshold is, you get £500 in your pocket. This cost the government, I'm told, nearly £5 million a year. I think it was brought up, and the Treasury Minister did look at this last year, but it's certainly one area where I think we could cut back, and that £5 million could be used to target other areas. Now, I have been criticised that I'm hitting the most vulnerable in society, but if the most vulnerable in society are people who are currently serving jail sentences in the Derby Hilton for trying to supply drugs to our children, then I don't think they're the most vulnerable in society. And nor do I think the most vulnerable in society are those who have large bank accounts who can offset their interest payments, their income, to the following tax year and still qualify for this £500 rebate. I think it's wrong, I think it's ill-targeted, and if elected, I would urge the Treasury Minister to scrap it immediately.
Sorry, could I just ask, do you know how many people in prison actually are in receipt of that £500?
Yes.
Yeah, I was given to
How
understand
many?
that's not the case anymore.
Well, that's not the...
That's not saying £5 million.
Well, it's the administration... May I? Sorry, no.
We don't want to start us questions flying. Mr. Dawson, have you finished answering the question from the gentleman in the corner?
Yes, I have, yes.
Mr. Gill, would you like to answer the gentleman's question, please, about cutbacks?
Thank you. Yeah, the question to answer on it is name one example of what's currently in the public, the government's portfolio that could be outside of that.
I think it's important that, you standing to be an HK, I think it's important to know that's an indication of your views on, where we can cut back.
Okay. Well, I mentioned earlier the importance to have the scope of government and to look at the value added across the board. But you asked for one example, and I'm happy to offer this. And I'm not saying this because it's a here and now issue. I'm saying it because my experience and my background, I've always believed this, and that is that public sector housing and housing for support for younger people to get onto the market is not working while we have the current system we have. I would put the government's housing stock into a housing authority, a housing association, independent of government, independent of all political input. I would offer every local authority the opportunity to join into that scheme. Those who are foolish enough not to take that offer, that will be a matter for them, but those who choose not to will be faced with a situation where they will have to deal with a diminishing deficiency for housing, which is basically the government subsidy for the housing budget. And I would say to the Housing Association, you have to manage that within certain parameters and certain guidelines. And instead of being responsible directly to Tynwald, which would just keep the political intervention and interference going, I would say we'll have a regulatory body who you will be answerable to, and the regulatory body will answer periodically to Tynwald. So that would £5 million saving. The housing deficiency, when I was in the House of Keys 18 months ago, was something like £10 million, but it was rising by £1 million a year. Now, I don't want public sector housing to be harsh or repressive. I want it to serve the purpose. But a housing association is the only way we're going to get an apolitical, needs-driven, fair system for public sector housing in the Isle of Man. And the other thing a housing association can do, if it's targeted and funded appropriately, is to introduce a shared equity scheme to allow our young people to become property owners in an affordable market where they have a long-term stake and vested interest in the success of the Isle of Man. So that would be my straightforward first answer to your question.
Thank you very much. And Mr Skinner, please, on the question.
Mine would be to reduce managers. There's too much, to me, government at middle level is bloated. Everybody's a manager, and it should some of the middle management should be taken out. But to come to Quintin's point about the housing, I would disagree with that. But what I would be in favour of is the public sector housing. Currently, there are 17 housing authorities on the Isle of Man. That needs reducing, and I would suggest, along with some of my colleagues on the council, down to 5, which is north, south, east and west plus Douglas. That would reduce costs. Douglas, particularly if I use that as the example, could then actually set its own rent, because Douglas is currently only responsible for 15% of that housing deficiency that government pay. But if the council were allowed to set its own rent, it would make more money available for repairs and maintenance to the property, and therefore reducing further costs. And that would also be a basis as 4+1 on which to restructure and rebuild local government. But and the other one I just wanted to clear up, that Clive made the comment about the £500. If a prisoner is has to go into custody, say in February, he gets the £500. But if he's in custody in the next tax year, he doesn't. So I hope that sort of clears that one up.
Thank you. And Mr Thomas, please.
To answer the question and then to make a couple of comments, I've got 3 things to choose between, and I'll give you the one I've chosen. The one I've chosen is one of my policies, which is to merge the Department of Social Care and the Department of Community, Culture and Leisure. So we've got 1 less chief executive, we've got 1 less minister, we've got quite a few less senior managers and middle managers, and it would make a lot of sense, and I think it's even coming to be part of government. It would also be in line with the way that society is going, because more and more we've got a community care in the community line, we've got local authorities being empowered, and I would like to think that a Department of Community, perhaps a bit like our old Dolgi in the old days, would be a wonderful suggestion, and it would encourager les autres to have 1 less chief executive and some less senior managers. The other one I was thinking about is this is a town constituency. There's lots of subsidies that we make to the rural areas in terms of rural schools versus our schools, in terms of size, in terms of buses and the like. So that would be another area that we should be making sure that we're prepared to pay the subsidy. And finally, we already saw we could apparently solve the bus dispute by just making people accept that a 3.5-year job employment doesn't entitle you to a full career-based pension system, so that would be another way of saving. I mean, Mr Dawson, though, we have to be realistic about some of your policies. I mean, £500, there are only 120 or so prisoners, and £500 times 120 is no near 5 million, and the people who get that 5 million are some of the neediest in society, as you just said. So why do you keep bringing up, misinformation about rates, which is what you did on Monday, misinformation about tax credits to the most vulnerable in society, and there's a few other things in your manifesto which verge on being untruthful, with all respect that's due and everything like that.
Okay, Mr Chairman, I'm going to have an opportunity to answer that criticism, because that wasn't fair.
Okay. Would you like to answer that criticism now, sir?
The personal tax credit, I've given that, I've investigated it, and that is on excellent authority. I won't mention the person who told me it is on excellent authority, and that is the true figure. There was no misinformation on rates. My manifesto said that in there, the council house tenant should receive a rates bill. Now, there's something on the internet today, or in Manxnet, or somewhere on Manx, it might be somewhere, but it says that they receive a statement. Council house rents are, and I agree with Quintin, it's in my manifesto, council houses should be taken out of the public domain and brought into the housing association. That's in my manifesto, because we don't get this political footballing. It's unfair to politics, it's unfair to the people who live in the houses. The fact of the matter is, the average rate bill in this constituency that I go around now, and I'm being conservative, is £1,000. That's £20 a week. Now, if you take that off the council house rent and take what's left, I think that's still a very, very low and reasonable rent to be paying for a 2- and 3-bedroom house by people who are occupying it, who are, a number of them are earning in excess of all the other people who are trying to make a living here out in the community. So I stand by my manifesto.
Yes, could I just say that myself, I served on a local authority on the island until very recently for over 20 years, and I can say that local social housing tenants in all sectors of it, including sheltered complexes, do pay rates.
But it is included in the rent.
My understanding, Mr Dawson, is that it is not included in the rent. The rent is one figure, the rates are added on to it, and it's calculated as 50 weeks per year, with 2 weeks at Christmas time. It's not a free period, it is that the rent for the 52 weeks is calculated and put into a 50-week period. But Mr Skinner has a short statement to read which will clarify it. Thank you.
Could I also just clarify that it's not Douglas Council that sets the rent. Rents are dictated by government. And a lot of people, the council get a lot of criticism when the rents go up, and it's not actually the council's fault. We are dictated to, and we're actually dictated to that from the rent, and only the rent, we are only allowed to take a third of that for the maintenance programme. But there was, the Borough Treasurer has sent an email to all members, which I think will explain this properly and hopefully put it to rest. And if I just read it, it said, "Dear all, it has recently come to my attention that public statements have been made indicating that the council housing tenants do not pay rates. In case any members of the council become involved in a debate over this subject, I am clarifying that the tenants do pay both borough rate and water rate towards their properties. Each year, a statement is provided to each tenant showing the amount of rent, rates and water rates being paid as part of the weekly rent. And I understand that the water rate is then calculated by the authority, and the council then pay what's asked for from the council."
Thank you for that, and that statement came from Mr Jeff Bolt, the Borough Treasurer for Douglas. Mr Thomas, you have something to add further, I believe.
Just to add, John, that since then, just later on this afternoon, it was actually a formal press release from the council. So that's what Mr Dawson saw on www.manxnet. That's a formal press release, just to clarify the misinformation. But also I wanted to say, we have a wider issue here, and the wider issue is the rating system. Okay, so in 1971, when Pulrose and Williston were rated, it was the rental value. That is what the rateable value. It's done by the government, not by the council. And obviously, when they've got new houses in the estates, they've been re-rated just the same as the private sector and the public sector. There's no difference. So it might be that we need, in fact, it is the case that we need a profound review of the rating system, and that's the way to address the perception that Mr Dawson has raised, rather than any other way. And just to clarify on Mr Dawson's calculations, because he's correct, you can get these figures. I mean, this goes back to my point about the freedom of the information. I doubt in any country in the world there's been such a full and frank provision of information about tax was given by the Isle of Man Treasury in the information document it proposed as the taxation strategy was being put together. And the answer to your question, Mr. Dawson, is that a couple of years ago it was £700 that was paid. Okay, and in 2010-11, they calculated that was 7 million. So you get your 5 million, I guess, by 700 minus 500 equals 5 million. But that's the 10,000 people. There are 10,000 people, and there aren't 10,000 people living in Derby. There are 10,000 people who are caring for somebody, who are unemployed, who need to get that benefit from the tax system. I think there should be a tax and welfare commission to actually look at all allowances, all benefits. It was in my manifesto in 2011. It's in my manifesto this time. The scope and structure government moved us forward profoundly, and so would an honest reflection on the tax and welfare issues across society, looking at the tax cap, looking at the marginal rate, looking at the rating system and all of these things, and that's what we need. It wouldn't take very long. The scope and structure was put together in 3-6 months. It wouldn't cost very much. That cost 80,000, and that's only the salary of one of the politicians, and so on and so on. And I want to get rid of 11 of them, and that's what we need. We actually need a proper and thorough investigation of these issues rather than encouraging ill-informed, misinformed perceptions. And the Mayor suggested it was even worse than that in his press statement when you will read it later on.
Right, thank you. Sir, in the doorway there, what would your question be?
My question is affecting everybody in this hall is the cost of living. And that cost of living, in my opinion, is comprised of, we've all had one of the longest and coldest winters. And there's 3 factors, I think, that's affecting us all. Is the cost of electricity, the cost of gas, and the steam packet, which is supporting a £200 million debt, which we are in this hall and others outside throughout the island are paying. So my question is this: if I lived in Northern Ireland, I could receive a bill from Southern England. I could receive a bill from Southern England to get to achieve the cheapest cost of living. Dual bills in the national papers have been £1,200 per household. I'd love to pay that bill. We are just paying astronomical sums for our energy costs. Nothing has been said about that. Nothing gets said. And we're also paying astronomical costs to the cost of living to support a £200 million debt on our carrier. So my question is, what solutions would the candidates have to solve some of these problems?
Mr. Chairman, could I just add to that? Recently I made inquiries, and electricity is considered to be some of the dearest in Europe. It is expensive, but it's only somewhere in the region of 30 to 40% above the English tariff. Gas is 70 to 80% above the English tariff.
Thank you, and I think that's relevant to the first question. Mr. Gill has offered to start us off on this one. Thank you.
There is no easy answer. If there was an easy answer, government would have applied it. If there was an easy answer, you would know it, Stephen. There isn't an easy answer. What I do take issue with you is the benefits that you suggest would flow from living in an environment like they do in Northern Ireland or the rest of the United Kingdom, where we have energy providers and you can shop around. That doesn't work well in England. Very few people actually do shop around, and England, particularly the mainland of Great Britain, is in an absolute mess. Its energy policy is a mess. Their commitments to the alternative, if you want to read a horror story, read an Open Europe review of CAREP, C-A-R-E-P, Community Alternative Renewable Energy Programme. It's an EU programme, and like many EU programmes, it's great on policy, it's great on politics, but it's absolutely fundamentally flawed on common sense. So there is no simple energy policy which is going to work. There's lots which don't work, and the UK are going down that road. And I actually think that, yes, our costs are reflective of the fact that we live in an island. They're higher than you would want them to be, but they're not astronomical. They're not excessive. They are a challenge to people, to many people. I know as a social worker that this has been a very difficult winter for lots of older people that I work with. I know that that's the reality. And government has a duty through the welfare system to actually support those people. But what they shouldn't do is try and interfere with the market, because they can't. not successfully. Through the welfare systems to support people who actually need that support. In terms of the gas costs, that's a private business. I'm not in a position to make an observation on that. And similarly in the steam packet, the single biggest, most unpopular aspect about living in the Isle of Man, where we, let's not forget, enjoy a hugely high quality of life and a lot of satisfaction with the life that we all enjoy. But the single biggest, most unpopular aspect of it is the cost not only of the steam packet, but of air transport to and from.
You don't think whoever built that power station to stop the Isle of Man from going bankrupt?
Sorry.
Whoever built that power station to stop the Isle of Man from going bankrupt?
I said earlier, the question was...
That power station we had there was nowhere near big enough to supply the Isle of Man.
The Isle of Man can generate sufficient electricity to meet our own demand. At the highest demand levels, we can meet our own, not only through Paul Rose can do that, but if Paul Rose is periodically offline for maintenance or for whatever reason, then Peel is a strategic backup.
Well, why don't
Peel,
we use gas then?
Peel is a strategic backup which is also used for exporting electricity at a profit to the United Kingdom. In my final year, we made over £5 million profit through exporting electricity through the interconnector. Last year it was 2. That's not because the MEA have become less hungry, that's because the market has changed. But I take your point that it's unpopular to have prices as they are, but you know what? It's a function of living in an island. And there is no easy answer to make it right.
The next thing will be the Irish, won't it? We have to pay for that.
We're getting into a separate... I hope I've answered your question as best I can, Stephen.
Thank you. Would another candidate like to take up the challenge?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, sadly, you know, as Quintin has just said, we do live on an island and we don't have competition. And gas company is a private company. And private companies are in business to make profit for its shareholders. The steam packet one, I mean, there's always been people saying government should be taking over the steam packet, but if you think that the steam packet run by government, and let's be honest, government are the world's worst at running things, the steam packet can't offer silly fares if it's run by government, because it's at least got to break even. So you just, you know, you need competition, and we've already proven in the past that with our ferry business, there's not enough business for two. And again, it comes back to living on an island, and sadly, it's the penalty we have to pay.
Thank you, Mr. Skinner. Mr. Thomas? Thank you.
So it's a huge question and can't, full justice can't be given to it, but I'll make 3 governance points. The first one is that the Office of Fair Trading has to have a role in the allegations of 70% for gas, 30% for electricity, and you know, the Office of Fair Trading report on the steam packet. You know, I think there was talk about partial publication. The court case that was going on for a number of years, the seaside shipping is finished now. Why can't we have that partial publication so we can see more information about what they found? First point. The second point about governance is that you know, one former politician who I respect and spent a lot of time with, he said that his greatest achievement was depoliticising the MEA and actually having for a period, you know, genuine engineers and all that sort of thing running the MEA. It went wrong, but perhaps we've gone too far to having politicians as chairman, and perhaps what we're talking about is a new way forward of actually, you know, Parliament and the people through its Parliament actually expressing objectives, and then actually having a regular system to actually monitor the management, going back to the system, learning from the lessons of Mr. Prophet and that era, and, you know, and coming back to it. And the third point about governance is that, you know, you will perhaps remember at the beginning I said that we should mutualise the MEA, we should give you all shares. And what I have in mind is every year in the Villa Marina there are hundreds of people discussing 2015, the 15-15 target and micro generation of electricity, and issues about whether MEA should really be called Isle of Man Utilities because it has gas and telephone and electricity, and one day it might have other things as well. And my point is that there are lots of connections, as I understand it. You know, Mr. Prophet had lots of good ideas, it's just they all went wrong somehow in execution. And, you know, that gas is probably something to do with there being a private company. You know, the state has paid for the massively expensive infrastructure, and then the gas company is the... That's my point. You know, that's my point. And it's much more than that. You know, the liability for the next for the lease on the pipeline, as I understand it, is currently valued at 40 million. Okay, it's going on till 2023, and that's a huge amount of number. So we've got to address the gas. We've got to address the gas issue as alongside it. So I think we could have a wonderful. We have got a good company now in the MEA, and we can make it even better with some of those ideas coming through. I just want to end on a really, really bad note to make the situation even worse than the one that Mr. Moore described, because we've got so much camouflage in the government accounts at the moment, and I've actually taken the liberty of putting 3 graphs in my manifesto to show you a bit about this camouflage. So for the last 3 years, the MEA hasn't been paying any interest on 135 million of its debt. No interest whatsoever. So that headline of 15 million or whatever it was, that's only 60% of the story. Eventually, the Treasury Minister confessed in the last budget, and pretty soon, if he confessed it, we're going to have to start charging interest again. So 2014, next budget, watch that space. The MEA management and board have got a huge challenge to actually manage prices in coming years. So, steam packet, obviously now, with the court case having ended, there's the potential for the use agreement to go all the way to 2026, and perhaps there'll be negotiations going on at the moment about extending it even further, so new ships can come in to meet the new environmental standards. And so, I was delighted to hear Mr. Cretney say recently, after a couple of years of pressure, that we would now perhaps have a competition for the market. Obviously, we can't have competition in the market, but perhaps we can invite competition and have a proper tender. If we're going to give a user agreement, we can perhaps ask for technical suggestions about what can be in the user agreement, and we can compare Irish shipping company, Baltic shipping company, our own shipping company, because we have to remember with the steam packet, it's nothing more now than a great history, a great tradition, a wonderful name, and then an operating company based out of Portugal that changed from a company based out of Australia, and so on and so on. So why don't we be honest and actually have a competitive tender for the user agreement next time we extend it? It was completely wrong what we did last time.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. And I think, Mr. Dawson, you've not spoke on this topic yet.
Just to clarify, in case there was any unsurety about my own personal view about steam packet, it was to not nationalise, but to take a controlling interest on it. I do believe it's this vital strategic link between us and the UK. If we were to lose that, I don't know what the Isle of Man would do. It still should be run as a proper private company, but I think the Isle of Man government would have been better than spending money perhaps on other projects to put money into a controlling asset on the steam packet. I think as far as gas prices are concerned, obviously I think the whole project, with the MEA, it cost much more than was anticipated. We're stuck, I believe, now with, I think it's a £10 million interest payment. And the last when I heard Mr. Tier speaking, he said, there was one option was to try and take money from the reserves and pay for it in full and get rid of this interest payment, but that's the way they calculate it isn't something they actually want to do at the moment. I think prices on the island have always been high. It's something that we have to live with, but I do think we should have some regulatory body to look into the prices on the Isle of Man that they have in the UK, and perhaps that's something we could move
monopolies legislation.
Yeah, something like that, where we can actually have a look at this whole issue of the fuel prices. And another option I know the Treasury Minister is looking at is that for some time now the personal tax allowance has been frozen, I think, for the last couple of years, and I know they are looking at that, whether that should be increased in order to offset some of the high prices and the high cost of living that people are finding on the Isle of Man.
Thank you. Yes, sir, at the back.
So far, nobody has spoken about anything on the international perspective. It was said at the beginning that the role of the MHK has changed. Have the candidates given thought to what position in the Isle of Man would be if Britain withdraws from the European Union, which there seems to be a move towards? And what thought is also given to the fact that the role of the government has changed in that over the past 10 years there are international relations which were not taking place at the turn of the millennium. We're having visits from foreign countries, and I would like to know some of their perspective of the international role of the MHK in this very different environment in which we now live?
Right. Is there anybody particularly on the panel who would like to start off? Yes, Mr. Gill is happy to proceed. Thank you.
You make an absolutely valid point, Peter, and I would say to you, I am the most avowedly Eurosceptic, Europhobic member of Tynwald during my time there, and I have no reason to change my opinion on that. I personally think that the irresistible, and it was an irresistible clamour that I have been part of for the public. We talked about referenda earlier. This actually is a subject. It's one of the rare subjects which should be subject to a referendum. It was in the 70s. Britain should be allowed a referendum on membership of the EU or not. I'm confident that if they were, and this is the reason why they're not going to be allowed it, if they were allowed it, they would vote overwhelmingly to leave, because it's a self-evident benefit to Britain. If Britain leaves, we would have to leave.
Should we get the vote?
That is a given. Should we get the vote? No, because we're associate members. But I will tell you just one anecdote. If probably the most influential person in British politics today, won't be in a year's time, but today is Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage came to the Isle of Man. I hosted him in the Tynwald buildings. The then Chief Minister wouldn't even have the courtesy to meet him. And I frankly think that that was disrespectful. At the same time, this is a former Chief Minister who, quite rightly, however gritted teeth, would shake hands with a Sinn Féin IRA member as a Tynwald guest. So I really think that we should be making friends with people whose opinions we might not agree with, but whose influence we should be trying to use to our advantage. That's what MHK should do. Will the EU fold up and fracture and disintegrate? I think it will. I'll probably anticipate will happen quickly, because every evil empire, and that's what this is, with no real mandate, fractures quickly. You only have to look back to the Soviet bloc, the British Empire, every empire in history. It will fold quickly. And what I say in my manifesto is we should be ready with contingency planning, and I believe we have got this, in fairness to the government, contingency planning to use our reputation, our international contacts, the tax agreements that we've been increasingly entering into to take advantage of that opportunity. Yes, it will be a threat on one level, but it will be an even bigger opportunity if we're light of foot and we utilise our resources and utilise our relationships. So it's an absolutely crucial consideration that you make. You're quite right to make it, but we shouldn't be scared of this. We should accept that one way or another the EU will fracture, and that's a good thing for democracy across Europe. And when that happens, the Isle of Man will be in a position, if we've got the contingency planning, to respond positively to it.
Maybe that's why Scotland is wanting to get away from England, because England is quickly disintegrating in its own way. How does the Isle of Man, does any of the panel have an attitude as regards to Manx independence, instead of being subservient to the English continuously?
Well, whether the candidates want to take that, but we do have a question on the go at the moment around the international role, and I'd like...
That all implies to it, isn't it? We're supposed to be independent.
Like the opportunity given to the other three. Would any of the other three candidates now like to speak on the question? Yes, please, Mr. Thomas.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Good question, and I'll perhaps come to Mr. Aston's as well. Mr. Murcott, thank you very much for a very good question. And I agree with Quintin, this is the sort of thing that we deserve a referendum on. Constitutional change, like LegCo abolition, or change in the relationship with the UK, or joining an international body, of course, is the sort of thing in constitutional and political history you have to have a referendum on, because unless it's with the consent and the will of the people, you shouldn't be changing the Constitution. So, various aspects. I'm not sure that the Isle of Man is actually an associate member of the EU. Obviously, we've got the Protocol 3 relationship, and I'm not sure Britain is a member of the EU. Obviously, the United Kingdom is a member of the EU, and that's questioned through the Scotland issue, and so I just wanted to put that into its context. In my manifesto, I ask a question, which is to assist international negotiations, could the island rejoin the European Free Trade Association, which we left when the UK joined the EU, because the Free Trade Association, if we had been a member, we'd have been like Norway and all those countries that got to speak on the table, but weren't actually members for all of the funds and the structural funds and the expenditure. And and simple question to the to the lawyer at EFTA, which I asked a couple of years ago, was, it depends. Perhaps it depends what you agree with the UK. So Mr. Aston is quite right to raise the issue. As I understand it, we've got a particularly good relationship with the UK at the moment. Despite what politicians do whenever anything goes wrong, apparently we've got a very good. And this is the sort of thing we should be talking about with the Lieutenant Governor and directly with the United Kingdom. You mentioned the word Britain. At the head of our constitutional relationship is the Lord of Man. And we've got an incredibly significant event in 2015, and one of the issues that I've been wrestling with is what we're going to do about that incredibly significant event. And it all goes back to the independence. What is that incredibly significant event in 2015? Anybody? To do with the Queen and so on and so on.
She exceeds Queen Victoria's reign.
I knew you'd know, Mr. Merkel. I knew there'd be somebody,
September the 15th.
I knew somebody would know. I didn't know. So on September the 15th, the Isle of Man will have the issue, and nobody in England's talking about it, nobody in Scotland's talking about it. Perhaps we can start talking with first. Perhaps we can have the Isle of Man Year of Culture 2014. Perhaps we can have the British Year of Culture for the other part of our identity in 2015. And perhaps in 2016 we can have the Year of the People, because in 2016 the people got up on Tynwald Hill and started throwing mud, apparently, at Lord Raglan and his entourage. So we could have 3 wonderful years that could actually revitalise tourism, could actually give this nation a new confidence, such that we could go out and actually build on our tax information exchange agreements and build on all of the other things that we've got to actually put together a new place inside the global community, perhaps, but certainly inside the British framework of nations. Thank you. I'm sure Mr. Merkel didn't set me up for that question.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas.
Sure.
Mr. Dawson.
Yes, a good question, isn't it? I'd love to see the UK come out of the EU. I think it would be absolutely fantastic for the Isle of Man. I think the Isle of Man is getting, I've spoken about this wave after wave after wave of legislation which is coming in from Europe. Europe still view us as a tax haven. No matter what the Isle of Man government does, we're still viewed as a tax haven. They actually, I'd go as far as to say, I think they really dislike us and would like us to close down and perhaps go back up to our Tholtons and reassure, but this is the way it is, that's the reality of Europe. So I am for all the diversification we can get. I'm glad to see Mr. Shimon going out to these various countries. I've had experience myself in Southeast Asia, but also in the Gulf. There's a lot of money out there looking for a home. It's not drug money, it's not naughty money, nasty money, it's not money laundering. There are honest people out there who have money who are looking for a home. They are looking for a base for financial transactions. And a lot of people in Europe are looking for a good home for their money after what happened in Cyprus. And I think the more we can distance ourselves from Europe, the more we can look after international markets, diversify our economy, change the way we're looking. At the same time, as Quintin said, let's remain friends where we can. But let's look after the Isle of Man the best I can. Let's get more focused on the Isle of Man. Let's get more blinkered about the Isle of Man. And let's push out into the international marketplace.
Thank you, Mr. Dawson. Mr. Skinner to
I'll be controversial on this one. I don't think the EU will fold, because I don't think the EU can afford to fold. And I think there are parties within the EU that will not let it fold. But I think we should, as Mr. Dawson has said, we should keep all our options open. We should keep in with all parties, irrespective of who they're in with, and look after ourselves. We are reliant on the UK, but I think we should become, within that, reliant on ourselves. And Mr. Aston's question, I don't think Scotland will become independent either, because they can't afford to. Scotland want to go independent because they think there's still oil reserves there. The glory days of the oil reserves have all gone, and it's not going to happen. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
They're contributing more. It's interesting to look at the Scottish question, because there's some very interesting things coming out of it.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions at all? Yes, sir. Oh, gentleman on the front row, followed by Mr. Gorn.
Mr. Thomas had touched on better ways possible to manage the debts that we've got in the likes of the MEA. I just wondered if you could explain that a little bit more in depth so we could all understand it.
Thank you. Mr. Thomas, sir.
Well, the MEA has, I think, 4 components to its debt. It's got the 185 million bond, which is due in 2034, and that might or might not be owned by the Isle of Man government through its fund managers. If it is, conceivably we could issue bonds to the people of Douglas West and the other people of the Isle of Man and to refinance that, because currently the international investors, or whoever they are getting interest on that bond at, I think it was from memory, it's 5 3/8%, and probably none of you are getting anywhere near 5 3/8% on your money. So if some way we can do that, perhaps we could do it. We can't buy it, we can't pay it back, it's a non-callable bond, but conceivably if we've bought it in the market somehow, we could refinance it. There's a 35 million loan, which the budget they passed in February actually is going to be repaid this year, and I think that's the one that Mr Tier is talking about issuing bonds, and that's probably why Mr Quayle has gone off to be the MEA chairman, because I seem to remember he was very, very enthusiastic for bonds and has been throughout his time. Then there's the gas lease, which we talked about already, which goes on till 2023, and that's to do with recreating probably the whole business model of how gas and electricity and all those things relate to each other. And then finally, there's this 135 million consolidated loan fund. And if I tell you that that's borrowings from the consolidated loan fund of the government, it's internal borrowings, it's not external borrowings, it's internal borrowings. And if I tell you that fund used to be worth 160 million a few years ago, and now it's expected to be 1 million in 2 years, you can see with Mr Tier's got a problem. He's got to start getting it back and getting interest on it in the next few years. And so we need to refinance that in some way if we're not going to all be paying through it through our excessive electricity prices. So there's some of the issues that the politicians are going to have to take into account. But these are technical matters that should be left to the board, and that, however, in my view, they're also political matters, and they should be left to the people as well, because it's 400 million debt we're talking about. It's 400 million of the National Reserve. Mr Dawson and others can perhaps suggest, 400 million, we just pay it off, but that's nearly a third of our national wealth, and then apparently we're going to buy the steam packet, and that's 200 million. That takes it up to half of our national wealth. We've saved 5 million on exploiting the very poorest in society. We've saved 5 million by sending out rates bills and setting up a new administration to send out rates bills to the council tenants, but we've just cost ourselves 600 million in nationalising the steam packet and 400 million in paying off the MEA debt. So we've got to be a bit more careful about how we talk about paying off debt and using our reserves, because we've only got 1.5 billion and we already owe 700 million.
Mr Chairman, can I answer the criticism, because that is not what I said. I'm sorry, that's not what I said. Just very quickly, Chris, I didn't say I'd nationalise the steam packet, nor did I say that we should pay off the MEA. I said Mr Tier at the Roman Coleman explained why he thought it wasn't a good idea to pay off that debt. That's what I said. I did in no way mention that I thought we should use that to pay off the MEA, nor nationalise the steam packet.
Thank you. Mr Gill.
Just very, very briefly, Chris mentioned earlier that he'd uncovered this dodgy deal between the Treasury and the MEA about having interest-free arrangements on the... And the reason that occurred was because Treasury have a representative on the board, quite rightly, so there's liaison. That was part of the problem when the unauthorised borrowings occurred. They have a political chairman, which is a legitimate role, which will prevent a repetition of the unauthorised borrowings occurring in the future. And Treasury said, if we make this arrangement, and we, as holders of the public purse, say you don't have to pay interest on this, the quid pro quo for that was that we would not have to do what we otherwise would have done, which was put your tariffs up and business tariffs. Business was suffering at that time. They were making it absolutely clear to us, and it wasn't a false concern, it was a legitimate concern that they were on the margins, and if we had to put them up to reflect those percentage costs, that would have been uncompetitive. It would have affected the economy. It would have affected everybody in this room's electricity tariffs, your bills. So that's why we did it. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't anything. There was nothing underhand about it. It was a political, fiscal decision made on sensible grounds, and it's worked. So I don't accept any criticism on behalf of the MEA, now or then, or the Treasury, for reaching that compact, because it was a sensible thing to do for everybody in this room and every business that any one of you works for.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we've got something else from Mr Thomas now, and That's something to quote.
It's just a point of order. It's just not anything dodgy, or every state entity is borrowing the same. It's on page 4 of the Pink Book. It's very simple. The Treasury has revised the rebalancing plan in the light of updated forecasts of income. As a result, a number of measures introduced last year to reduce spending have been retained, namely retaining the interest rate on the Consolidated Loans Fund at 0%, minimising the annual allocation from revenue into the capital fund, utilising interest and reserves to meet revenue spending. These remain temporary measures and are tended to be removed when receipts recover. So it affects the MEA, it affects WASA, it affects everybody else except for the local authorities practically. The local authorities are paying all the interest and paying all of the money because we've borrowed that from the Isle of Man Bank, but everybody else in government has had a 3-year interest rate waiver, which, we can all do that on our houses, but it comes home eventually, you still owe the interest, and that's what's been going on, and that's why the capital fund has gone down from 160 million to 1 million. It's not dodgy, it's all there in the Pink Book in the budget that was approved by politicians in February.
Thank you. Just before you, sir, and I'm conscious of the time now. It's perhaps not as fast as that, is it? I'll make it about 26 minutes past, but hey-ho. I'm glad the MEA aren't listening too closely. The lights have stayed on and we need them down at this time of night, don't we? But Mr. Gorn had a question. Would you like to put that, sir?
Mr. Chairman. Yes, throughout the evening there's been numerous references to the more vulnerable members of our society, both directly and indirectly from the candidates and also from some of the questions. And of course, protecting the vulnerable is one of the 3 strategic themes underpinning government policy at the present time. Would the candidates like to tell us how they would protect the more vulnerable members of society, what actions they would take, given the weakness of legislation in this area and the financial implications of doing so?
Right. Which candidate would like to start us off on this? Anybody, any views they'd like to answer, Mr. Gorn? No? Mr. Thomas?
Nobody else will. I mean,
be brave.
It's a very, very huge question, and it can't possibly do justice to the answer, especially at the level Mr. Gorn is probably expecting. But I'll just give one example. One of my manifesto pledges is to assist the elderly and disabled to remain at home with 3 schemes, and I'll give them out. Number 1, adequately funded AIDS and adaptation scheme. Because closing down Glenside without thinking just it saves money is not the whole case. You need to modify a bathroom. You need to do different entry. Number 1. Number 2. How about direct payments to assist in that process? So at the moment, I know there have been changes in that area of social care, but direct payments is something we brought in from Northern Ireland, and it's a very good area. And finally, in the UK now, it's the idea of paying to assist carers to do the job that state workers used to do is an area that's being investigated. So there are 3 very positive schemes to address one area of the disadvantaged in society.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Thomas. Mr.
Yes,
Dawson?
I'll certainly have it. There are a lot of vulnerable people in our society, and I don't think sometimes the government brings in legislation that is one size fits all, and quite clearly from the experience I've had in going around the constituency, that isn't so. Take, for example, an elderly lady who is living in her own home, who fears now that because she might have to go into care, or a husband who's just fallen and who's now disabled, she may well lose her house. She's a vulnerable person in our society. Another lady who doesn't actually want to go on benefit, she owns her own house, but actually what she wants is, she's partially blind, all she wants is some form of transport, regular transport she can rely on to take her guide dog for the blind with her to do her shopping. She is a vulnerable person in our society. Another vulnerable person in our society is a lady who has a special needs boy. He is now 19 years of age. She's not asking for full support. She's not asking for a home with him. She's building a wing on the side of a house. What she's asking for is some respite care. And that's all she really needs. So I think there's so many different cases of vulnerability in our society that when we just say, oh, we'll put this benefit or give that benefit, it doesn't target necessarily the real vulnerable people that are living in Douglas West, who are forgotten, who are just at home and maybe not taken care of. And one further point, and I mentioned it in my manifesto, I think without voluntary organisations, the social fabric of the Isle of Man would collapse. And that is why I would like to see a focal point in Tynwald. It wouldn't necessarily have to be a minister or anybody, but one focal point that voluntary organisations could go to as a whole, rather than going to different departments and perhaps get some assistance with some of the desperately needed logistical issues that face voluntary organisations helping the most vulnerable in our society.
Could I just answer that, Mr. Chairman? We already have that focal point. It's been established for the last 5 years and is working extremely well.
Excellent.
Thank you. Mr. Gill.
Thank you. I answered this. This is not a put-up question, but I did answer the question earlier when I mentioned about charitable, engaging in charitable organisations and the increasing role that they will, I believe, have in working in partnership with government. And I would put the same challenge to everybody in this room. You're obviously civic-minded, otherwise you wouldn't be here. You're obviously interested in the community. You're obviously interested in the welfare of the Isle of Man. I am. When I was living in the south, I recognised that we had a lot of older people who were vulnerable because they were living alone, they were isolated, they were basically lonely, and they were at risk. So rather than think government should do something, some friends and I said, we should do something. So we formed Southern Befrienders. You have a similar thing in Douglas, the Live at Home schemes. And they're brilliant, they work. They are so cheap to the government compared to what the alternative provision directly would be. But the most important benefit they do is they engage people. So we have a coordinator in each scheme. That coordinator marries up people who are volunteers, who want to make a difference. And it marries up with people who are vulnerable and in need. And the purpose is to keep people within their own homes. That's just one scheme. You can have similar schemes, all sorts of able. But the principle is important. It's about us as communities helping ourselves, helping those in our communities. And we can do that. The model is successful. Government is supportive. Government is responsive. The CVO, which David deserves a great deal of credit for, is a focal point to help that happen, and we will need to do more of that. As we have an ageing population, we will need to do it for that sector of our community, but there are other sectors. And I would say to every one of you, get involved, make a difference, because if we all make a small difference, it will have a huge impact, and we're going to have to do that.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Skinner.
Yes, I went to the launch of one of the Living at Home schemes. I know we don't have one in West Douglas, and I did ask the girls who were doing the presentation why we don't have one, and basically they said because nobody's come forward to set one up yet. So that's something I would like to see, which does enable the elderly to stay in their home longer. Third sector, I've initiated talks. There was no communication between Mr. Gordon's organisations and Douglas Corporation. I've asked questions within the council, and there's now dialogue formed between the two. The other thing is the vulnerable disability discrimination. I think it's a great shame that the whole bill wasn't taken as a whole, because we now have the thorny subject to some of two people who want to live together in a house, and we're making great play that we should have greater legislation. But here we are to this Disability Discrimination Act. Why are we legislating for something which we should do naturally as human beings?
Thank you. I'm is that the alarm clock, is it? I'm conscious of the time, but there's a gentleman sitting over there. I'll allow that question, your question, sir.
Right, thank you.
And if after that, I'd like to ask the candidates to sum up, give you all a couple of minutes each, and by that time I think we'll be sort of ready for heading off, because I'm sure you all want to have a bit of a chat amongst yourselves as you run out the door. So thank you, sir. We can put your questions to the panel.
I know two of the candidates are
quiet, please,
on the Douglas Town Council, but what's the candidates' views on the disparity in rates? We have the ridiculous situation of sort of Governor's Bridge, where one side of the road are paying £1 more than the others. You talk about the vulnerable, people living in a house on their own are paying the same rates, and in many cases people are now paying far more in rates than they're paying in tax. I, as a pensioner, personally think I get quite good return for a medical, my dentist, my TV, a bus pass. I can't say I get that same benefit from my rates.
Thank you, sir. I think everybody is in sympathy with you generally. Would any of the candidates like to kick this one off?
Well,
Disparity in rates?
Perhaps it's the start of an all-Ireland rate, which would help solve your problem.
If you can carry that forward in the election.
I put it in my manifesto that I support an all-Ireland rate.
No.
It's not in the post yet till tomorrow.
Thank you, Mr. Skinner. Any other candidate like to take up the cudgel? No? Mr. Thomas?
Want to go first?
Up to you, naturally.
Please, Mr. Dawson.
No, up to you, Chris.
This is like a quarter bridge round.
Will it be like this on Thursday next week?
The great thing about Douglas West is that from 2011 that there was gentlemen and gentle ladies who contested it, and I'm sure in the same way that people were teasing me on the radio about sitting next to Mr. Shimon if I was to be elected, because I've already said I disagree with him on one issue. That's the wonderful thing about this contest. It's going to be very fair and honourable. So thank you very much, Mr. Dawson. On rates, it can't be quite as simple as an all-Ireland rate, because Douglas would lose and we'd have to pay even more in rates if we had an all-Ireland rate, because Douglas, along with Maloo and Braddon and Bride, has more than our fair share of rateable value. The basic issue is that Douglas Borough Council spends a hell of a lot more because we pay for lots of things that in other towns the nation pays for, and because we have 285 staff, whereas the next largest local authority has, a fifth of that. Onken, for instance. Onken, we've got a gentleman here sitting from Onken, the chairman indeed. Thank you very much for coming, sir. We've cooperated a lot over the years, Douglas and Onken, but we don't cooperate so much now, but hopefully we will in the future. But Onken has 28% less than the average rateable value, and Douglas has 28% more, and your rates are £2.75 in the pound. £2.75? And ours are £3.95, just what you said. So basically, and this is the reason why I work with a group of people to set up a residents' association, we've got to look at the way that Douglas goes about doing its business, and we've got to think about the subsidies that the ratepayers are paying, which perhaps in other towns they don't pay, and we've got to see how much they're spending on street lights and waste collection and all that sort of thing. And all that sort of thing. So it's my manifesto pledge is that Douglas rates should move to the all-Ireland level, but it's not quite as simple as just having an all-Ireland rate, because then there'd be a Yugoslavia situation where war would break out, because it would emerge that Douglas rates were going up even more. We have 50 people whose benefits, we have 50 people whose total package is more than 60,000. Onken has 2. And we're only 3 times bigger. We have 5 times the number of staff at Onken. That's the sort of detail that we've got to go in to solve this problem. We can't just, say, like people have said before, this is an all-Ireland rate we need. In one sense, we've got to go into the detail to find out how to save and how to keep the efficiency and the effectiveness and learn from one council to another. Sorry about that long answer.
Right, thank you, Mr. Thomas. Mr. Gill?
I will be brief, but you raise an important issue. My own feeling for a long time has been local authorities have had the opportunity to work together to have a scale of economy and share services and share administration. They've all failed to do that. They've all failed to engage in a long-term, meaningful, sustainable manner. And therefore, and I don't know what the outcome is, but the process we need to engage now is cutting down the number of local authorities and getting that scale of economy. And I think as earlier I mentioned about getting rid of the housing stock from government and offering local authorities a housing stock, if some of those roles are taken from the local authorities and put into effectively a voluntary sector, then the reason for having local authorities will have to reflect that. And the only way that local authorities, and if you look out of town, if you look south, I can tell you some local authorities have next to no real authority, next to no role. So it's just mad. So we are overdue now for local authority reform. I don't have a fixed, strong view on what it should look like, but I do think we should commit to that process.
Mr. Gill, the local authorities have asked the government department to give us their housing stock, and we'll look after it, and we'll manage it within our own budgets at no cost to government. I'm open for a response, and it hasn't come back to us. All local authority has done. Douglas have asked for it, Onken have asked for it, Ramsey have asked for it. There's a simple saving there to be made. Yeah. When's government going to listen to local authority?
Good question. I think that there are many aspects and issues with regards to the questioner's original question, which was the disparity of rates. and you've only got to look at the information to find that that is the case island-wide. Mr Thomas mentioned Bride and some other authorities, but there is a huge disparity, and if you looked into it, it might open your eyes a little bit. Anyway, Mr Dawson.
Yeah, thank you. Again, I agree with you. You know, the level of rates also for single people like yourself. And I think the water rate as well will probably shock you when you get both rates. You know, the town council rates and you get the two together. And there are many people in this constituency who are only who are elderly living on their own, and this I agree it needs to be looked at. But I agree with Chris, believe it or not, and also Quintin to a certain extent. I take the point from the local council, but until we can get such agreement, I am in favour, as I say in my manifesto, of bringing housing into a housing authority, just for the allocation of housing, not starving the local councils from the rent that they get for them in order to upkeep those houses. But also I think that we need to look at the cost of administration, and I spoke about that previously, about the scope of government reducing town councils. At the end of the day, it's all about money. It's all about how much we spend on delivering services, and unless we can save on that, then we can't reduce the rate. So we need to look carefully. And another thing, one of my manifesto points was this relationship between whoever the MHK is now and the other 7 MHKs in Douglas, their relationship with the Douglas Town Council. I think that could be improved, and I think we could work very, very closely together in order to make sure that we offer a very, very efficient service to the Douglas ratepayers.
Thank you, Mr Dawson. And finally, Mr Skinner.
Could I just make a comment on the rates? I mean, Douglas rates have been higher for many, many years than anybody else. But the main reason why Douglas rates have increased this year, and Mr Cretney would deny this, is the fact that we are being charged more for disposal of waste. And currently we're having to pay £57 per tonne to get rid of our waste to the government. And I can tell you that in 2018, and it will be index linked on top of this, it will cost £161 per tonne to dispose of rubbish.
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your questions, both the written and the oral ones. I've primed the candidates, as I said at the beginning, 2 minutes each to sum up. And I'll do this in reverse order now. They've had warning of it. So I'd like to ask Mr Chris Thomas, would you like to sum up, sir? 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for taking part. And as I want to agree with Quintin, basically,
quiet, please.
Basically, this has been a wonderful evening of civic pride and civic discussion, and that's what politics is all about. And that's, I would be a public representative with your vote, and that's the nature of why I stand. It's to have this sort of discussion. So please spend your vote wisely, i.e. vote for me. And I made a pledge in my manifesto, and it's been on my website, and the pledge is in 3 parts in one sense. The first one is to continue to engage. So I've talked about communicating online, and I actually do use quite a few of the forums and other social media in my own name, and face-to-face. And I've actually had 5 meetings with about 200 people coming on seaweed, on Residents Association, and on LegCo, and health and education. Secondly, the other point is that I would work with others for an alternative. It's not just about sniping from the sideline. It's not just about being opposition. You won't hear me use the word opposition, in fact. Mine is a programme for government. It's about working with others. It's about the same as how John and I have worked in the council. There were 8 new people in the council, and we've had to learn to work together. And I think everybody in the council would agree that that's been a positive experience. And the third role of an MHK, which I would like to think that I've done okay for the last year, is to follow up the issues and the complaints, and the pending the creation of an ombudsman office and an ombudsman scheme. And so there are a whole number of issues that you have the privilege to be involved in. And I say it's a privilege because that's the role of a public representative. And if you don't want to be looking at aids and adaptations or unfair dismissal or looking at clinical recommendations and stopping somebody dying, that's not why you shouldn't be an MHK. That's all part of the job. Thank you very much.
Mr. John Skinner.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for your attendance again tonight. From talking to the people in West Douglas, they tell me that what they want from their MHK is someone who's local, accessible, accountable and honest. I believe that building on the work I've already done in the short time on Douglas Council, that I'm the person they're looking for. Thank you.
Mr. Quintin Gill.
Thank you. I won't take 2 minutes because we've all had a long evening. All I will say to you is I would thank everyone for attending. Thank you very much and for the engagement. I would thank the church for allowing us to use their premises, Councillor Malarkey, the Mayor, for organising this thing, and the Chairman for chairing it so ably. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Next Thursday, you all have an opportunity to put a cross next to a name. You don't have to put a cross next to a name, you don't have to vote for us, but I think you have a duty to do that, and I think the person that will represent Douglas best is someone with experience, someone with a proven track record, and someone who will make one promise, and it's the same promise that I made to my daughters when I was first elected. They were schoolgirls at the time, and I was conscious that I didn't want them being distressed by the attention that my role would bring me. And that was a simple promise that I said, whatever happens, no one will say your dad has been dishonest or lazy. And that's the only promise I can make. It's the only promise any of us can make, but I'm making that to you today. My commitment is to Douglas, to the people of Douglas West, and I hope that you will join me in that and reflect that next Thursday. And finally, and I have cleared this with the landlord, I'm speaking solely out of interest to promote local business. I will be going to the Woodburn pub later. If anybody wants to continue this conversation in a more convivial atmosphere, I'd be more than happy to do that. But thank you very much for attending. Good night.
Mr. Dawson, please, sir.
Yes, I'd like to thank the Chairman, first of all, for chairing the very interesting debate tonight. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
I'd also like to thank you all. I'd also like to thank you all for coming. I must admit the numbers exceeded my expectation. So thank you very much indeed for turning out. We've had a lively debate. I said I'd raise issues, and I've certainly raised some issues, and we have had a lively debate here. So again, thank you for that. One of the questions that has been put to me when walking around the constituency, knocking on the doors, not at many households, but one or two, is why should I vote? And it's a reasonable question. What's the problem? Why should I vote? You know, I'm fed up with everything. Well, I've had experiences in countries where we couldn't have this debate tonight. We couldn't ask that question. We couldn't raise the issues that we've raised tonight. And prisons throughout the world, and battlefields throughout the world, and streets throughout the world are stained with the blood of millions who've stood up to allow us to have the democracy which we take for granted. And we do take democracy for granted. Please vote next Thursday. Encourage other people to vote next Thursday. I know by-elections can be pretty boring, mundane things, but I'm sure we need to get out and vote. So please, whoever you vote for next Thursday, make sure you vote. And when you vote, make sure you vote for somebody who you believe in the policies they put down. Can they serve you as constituents of Douglas West? Can they best serve the people of Douglas? Can they best serve the people of the Isle of Man? And can they venture out and grasp the opportunities that exist internationally? Thank you for your time.
Well, can I thank you all for your determination in staying tonight, for coming along in the first place. It's very heartening for local politics to see such a good turnout tonight. I'm sure the likes of Mr. Delaney here on the front row, and councillors that are here, and other politicians that have trod this area before are encouraged by the continued enthusiasm in Douglas West. much.